She was 19 and homeless. No coat, no bed, no working phone, just a canvas satchel and $4 she had earned washing coffee mugs in the back sink of a diner that had already forgotten her name. And with that $4, she bought a Naturalist cabin off a mossed logging spur near Forks in Clallam County, Washington, a place county records said had fallen off survey maps in 1991. The roof sagged where the cedar shakes had gone soft. One wall leaned so far the rain entered sideways. The county had condemned it since 2008 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that inside the rear wall of a cedar diorama display case, behind the glass eyes of a barred owl, in a sealed compartment that had not been opened in over 30 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Mae Wren had been waiting her whole life without knowing it. She had waited in school hallways with her book bag held against her ribs, listening for the bell that meant she could go home late enough to miss supper conversation. She had waited beside laundromat dryers while other children ran sugar-sticky fingers over the vending machines, and their mothers folded warm towels into neat white squares. She had waited on the edge of adult rooms, still as a pressed fern, learning early that some houses required a child to become less visible than dust. She was born in Aberdeen, down where the rain came off Gray's Harbor with the smell of diesel, seaweed, and wet rope. Her first crib had been a dresser drawer lined with quilts because her mother was 19 then, too, and her father was already moving in and out of seasonal work with a duffel bag that never stayed unpacked. He was not cruel. That was the truth Luna kept, because truth mattered to her even when it had no use. He was simply unfinished, a young man with sawdust in his cuffs and a way of promising tomorrow as if tomorrow were a place that could be reached by wanting. Her mother, Elise, had a narrow face, careful hands, and a habit of looking toward windows whenever anyone asked her what she needed. She worked front desk at motels, then checkouts at thrift stores, then the night counter at a pharmacy where the lights made everyone seem a little sick. On mornings when Elise came home after sunrise, she smelled faintly of receipt paper and wintergreen gum. She would sit at the kitchen table without removing her coat and let Luna brush the rain out of her hair. Those were the gentlest mornings. The kettle on, the apartment dim, the whole gray world held back by one thin curtain. Luna's father disappeared by inches, which is often how people leave when they cannot bear the ceremony of leaving. First, he missed a birthday. Then 2 months passed without a call. Then a postcard came from Coos Bay with a lighthouse on it and 3 lines written in a hand Luna did not recognize as belonging to anybody who had once lifted her onto his shoulders. After that, nothing. Her mother kept the postcard in a cookbook she never used, between recipes for pot roast and lemon bars, and never spoke his name unless some form required it. By the time Luna was 8, the person who saved her weekends was not a parent, but her mother's older brother, Silas Wren. Uncle Silas lived in a narrow greenhouse near the edge of timberland outside Hoquiam, where salal grew thick. Along the fence and the sheds leaned beneath the weight of tools, jars, boards, and patient unfinished work. He was a retired museum preparator from a natural history room that had closed when funding went thin. That was how he said it. Funding went thin. He never said the town stopped caring. He never said schoolchildren no longer came to stand beneath whalebones and glass cases. He had a habit of protecting the dignity of abandoned things. On Friday afternoons, if her mother's shift allowed it, Luna rode with Silas in his old blue pickup, knees against the dashboard, a paper sack of apples between them. He never asked her too many questions, He never filled silence because silence was there. He let it sit beside them like a third passenger, listening to the tires hiss over wet pavement. Saturday mornings began with oatmeal, black tea, and a long table beneath a north window. That table was the first altar Luna ever knew. On it were blotting papers, bone folders, linen tape, magnifying lenses, glassine envelopes, sewing needles, soft brushes, cotton batting, borax, cedar chips, brass pins, and 2 wooden presses tightened by hand screws worn smooth from decades of use. Silas taught her to press plants before he taught her to sweep the shop. A leaf could not be bullied flat, he said. A stem had to be arranged while it still remembered the field. He showed her how to lay foxglove without crushing the bell of the flower, how to split a fern so both faces of it could be seen, how to write the date, place, weather, and soil in a steady hand. Forks. Drainage ditch beside county road. Rain at noon. Clay loam. Western sword fern. New fronds. Keep notes exact. He told her, because exactness was a form of mercy. Taxidermy came later, and only after he had made certain she understood reverence. There was no hunting in his teaching, no trophies, no boast. He took in road-killed birds, window-struck thrushes, a squirrel found frozen beneath a mailbox, a saw-whet owl brought to him by a ranger with his hat held low. He taught Luna to look before touching, to measure twice, to lay each feather with a brush rather than a finger, to keep the curve of life even after life was gone. The room smelled of cedar dust, paper, rain-wet wool, and the faint mineral scent of old bones. Luna came to know the names of tools the way some children know the names of cousins. Scalpel, awl, caliper, pinning block, tamping rod, curved needle. She knew the difference between a specimen made to impress and a specimen made to honor. She knew where the linen thread was kept, and which drawer stuck in December, and how Silas hummed 2 notes under his breath when he was pleased with a wing set right. Every Sunday at 4, they walked the narrow path behind his house with a notebook in Luna's coat pocket. He made her describe what she saw without borrowing easy words. Not pretty, not ugly, not just green. Green could be alder-leaf green, bottle-glass green, liverwort green, or the bruised green of hemlock shadow. Rain could be new, settled, slanting, wind-thrown, or fine as breath. He did not praise quickly, but when she found the right word, he nodded once, and that nod warmed her longer than applause could have. The quote she remembered most came after she ruined a violet by pressing too hard. Silas lifted the torn flower on the blade of his knife, laid it aside, and said, "Careful work teaches the hand to tell the truth." He did not scold. That was why the sentence stayed. It meant that care was not softness, and patience was not weakness. It meant a person could handle the breakable world without taking possession of it. It meant Luna had a way to live, even if nobody ever named it for her. Silas died in October, when Luna was 14 and the vine maples along the logging roads had turned the color of banked coals. He had been splitting kindling behind the greenhouse, wearing his wool cap and the old canvas apron with the pocket full of pencil stubs. A neighbor found him at dusk, one hand open on the wet grass, as if he had set down whatever burden he had been carrying and forgotten to pick it back up. After the funeral, adults went through his rooms with cardboard boxes and lowered voices. Luna stood by the north window table, her palms flat on the wood, and watched the world become practical. The plant presses went first, taken by a cousin who said they would look good in a restaurant. The glass jars vanished into a dealer's van. The owl forms, the calipers, the brass pins, the stitched leather tool roll, the field notebooks tied in cotton tape, the cabinet of local mosses, even the blue pickup, all passed into hands that did not pause. Luna asked for the table. She asked for one press. She asked for the notebook from the Sunday walks. Her Aunt Maribel, who had become executor because she was the one with a filing cabinet and a voice people obeyed, told her grief made children sentimental. Then she placed Silas's magnifying lens into a box marked miscellaneous and closed the flaps with a strip of clear tape. The tape made a clean sound. After Silas, Luna's life took on the temperature of stored water. Her mother moved them inland for a while, then back toward the coast, then into the spare bedroom of Aunt Maribel's house on the edge of Forks, where tourists came looking for rainforest, beaches, vampires, elk, silence, and whatever else they could photograph through a rented windshield. Maribel Wren owned a 2-story house with cedar siding and a view of Highway 101. She kept it smelling of lemon oil, bleach, and the cinnamon candles she lit before guests arrived. Every pillow had a place. Every towel was folded in thirds. Every object that belonged to Luna was treated as if it had been caught trespassing. By law, Maribel became her guardian after Elise signed the papers. That was the phrase everyone used. Signed the papers. Nobody said what it cost a child to watch her mother write her name beneath a line she did not seem to understand. Elise had begun moving through days like a woman hearing music from another room. Soft, distracted, unreachable. She visited sometimes, bringing discount store socks or a bag of oranges, then leaving before Maribel returned from errands. The college fund had come from Silas. That was the part Luna knew because he had told her himself one Sunday, not with pride, but with the plainness of a man labeling a jar. He had put enough away, he said, for community college. Books, perhaps 2 years at a university if she worked summers and lived modestly. No grand thing, he told her. Enough to open a door. For 5 years, Luna kept that door in her mind. She studied biology at the public library because the school textbooks were thin and tired. She memorized Latin names under the covers. She filled cheap notebooks with drawings of lichens, bones, seed pods, and wing structures. She worked mornings before class shelving canned goods at a grocery store and afternoons cleaning rooms at the Rainline Motor Lodge, where Maribel had friends who liked cheap labor and girls who did not complain. Then, in the spring after graduation, Luna learned the door had been removed. It happened without shouting. Most harm in Maribel's house happened without shouting. Her aunt sat at the kitchen island with reading glasses low on her nose, scrolling through bank statements on a laptop, tapping one lacquered fingernail against the counter. Outside, 2 German tourists were unloading suitcases from a silver rental car because Maribel had begun letting rooms by the week. The fund was gone, Maribel said. Fees, household costs, medical bills, maintenance, food, utilities, all the ordinary burdens adults understood and children did not. Luna stood with dishwater cooling around her wrists and looked at the steam fading from the sink. There was no paper offered, no ledger, no apology. Only Maribel's mouth arranged in the expression she used when a guest complained about damp sheets. After that, the house grew narrower. Maribel moved Luna's books from the spare room closet into plastic bins in the garage. Then the bins were stacked behind paint cans. Then the bedspread was changed. Then Maribel began referring to the room as the West Guest Suite, though it had never been a suite and had no west-facing window. Reservation calendars appeared on the refrigerator beneath a magnet shaped like a salmon. The eviction came on September 18, 2022. Rain had been falling since before dawn, not hard, but steady enough to silver the porch steps and darken the gravel drive. Luna came home from an early shift at the motel with a blister on her heel and the smell of industrial detergent in her hair. On the porch sat her canvas satchel, her winter boots, 3 paperbacks tied with twine, and a shoebox containing Silas's Sunday pencil, the only object of his she had managed to keep. Beside the shoebox lay her birth certificate in a plastic sleeve. Maribel opened the door before Luna knocked. She wore pearl earrings, a gray cardigan, and the composed face of a person doing something she had already justified to herself. Behind her, near the staircase, Elise stood with both hands wrapped around a mug. Her eyes were lowered to the steam. Maribel held out a white envelope. The edge of it had softened in the wet air. "Your things are outside. Do not come back." 8 words. Luna took the envelope because a hand will often obey before the soul understands. Inside were $27, a bus schedule, and a printed list of shelters from Port Angeles to Olympia. Her mother did not move. The mug trembled once, just enough for tea to touch the rim. Then Elise set it down on the hall table and folded her hands in front of her. That was the betrayal Luna carried longest. Not the spent fund, not the rented room, not even the porch with her life gathered into damp piles. It was the soundless place where her mother might have spoken and did not. Luna bent, tucked the shoebox into the satchel, and lifted the boots by their laces. She left the paperbacks because the twine had already soaked through and the covers were swelling. Halfway down the drive, she heard the door close with careful softness. Not slammed. Not hurried. Careful. For 6 weeks, she moved through western Washington as if the rain itself had misplaced her. The first night, she slept under the narrow shelter at the Forks Transit Center, sitting upright against a metal post with her satchel strap looped around her wrist. Logging trucks sighed through town before daylight. A man in a reflective jacket asked if she was waiting for the first bus, and she said yes because yes was shorter than explaining anything. She rode to Port Angeles with $11 folded in her sock. The bus windows were fogged, and every curve of Highway 101 showed her the same lesson from a different angle. Dark trees, pale water, rock face, ditch, another mile. In Port Angeles, she slept behind the public library beneath an overhang that smelled of wet concrete and cigarette ash. She spent $1.29 on a plain roll and drank water from the restroom sink, cupping it in both hands. For 3 days, she looked for work. Diners wanted local references. Motels wanted an address. The grocery store said the schedule was full. She washed in library bathrooms with brown paper towels that softened and tore. She read job postings on a public computer until the session timed out, then went outside and walked because walking kept her from becoming an object someone might ask to move along. From Port Angeles, she went to Sequim, where the rain thinned but the wind cut harder across the open lots. She slept one night behind a closed garden center between stacked bags of bark mulch and empty clay pots. In the morning, frost had whitened the cuffs of her jeans. She bought peanut butter crackers and kept the receipt, not for any reason except that paper made a life feel recorded. By the second week, she had $18.40. In Bremerton, she found 2 days of dishwashing at a seafood counter near the ferry terminal. The owner paid cash and gave her a bowl of clam chowder after closing, setting it on the stainless counter without looking at her too directly. Luna ate slowly, scraping the spoon along the bottom only after the kitchen lights had dimmed. That night she slept in a 24-hour laundromat, head against a humming dryer, waking each time the attendant passed with a mop. In Tacoma, a shelter had a bed, then no bed. A woman in a red knit hat showed her which church basement served breakfast on Thursdays. A bus driver let her ride 2 stops without fare when rain filled the gutters and Luna's shoes had begun to split at the side. She stored these kindnesses carefully, not because they fixed anything, but because they proved the world had not gone entirely blank. By the 4th week, she had $9.16. She learned which libraries opened earliest. Olympia at 10. Tacoma's main branch at noon on Sundays. Aberdeen at 11 when staffing allowed. She learned to sit where she could see an outlet, even though her phone had stopped charging reliably and finally went black for good beneath the fluorescent lights of a county reading room. She learned to keep moving before security learned her face. She did not call her aunt. She did not call her mother. The numbers were in the dead phone, but even before it died, her thumb never touched them. There are doors that close from the inside. Luna had heard one close in the rain. By late October, she was back near the coast, thinner in the face, carrying the satchel, the shoebox, one extra shirt, and a library card bent at the corner. She slept under the eaves of a closed feed store outside Montesano, then in an unlocked hay barn near Humptulips where mice moved like whispers along the wall. The hay held a little warmth. The roof ticked all night. In the morning, she brushed straw from her hair and found a burr caught in the hem of her coat. Her money had become $4.03. The 3 cents went into a penny tray at a gas station because she could not bear the sound of them loose in her pocket. That left the folded bills. 4 worn dollars, gone soft at the creases. She kept them inside Silas's shoebox beneath the pencil, as if his small cedar-smelling relic might keep them from vanishing. 2. The classified ad appeared on November 2, in the Forks Public Library, on a bulletin board near the copier where people posted babysitting offers, firewood notices, estate sales, church suppers, lost dogs, free kittens, and handwritten warnings about flood-damaged appliances. Luna had come in from the rain with numb fingers and no plan beyond warmth. The librarian, a heavy-set woman with silver hair pinned in a coil, looked at her shoes and then looked away with deliberate mercy. Luna chose a chair in the back, near local history, and opened a discarded newspaper because reading anything gave her a reason to remain indoors. The ad was no larger than 2 inches, clipped from a county surplus sheet and pinned crookedly with a green thumbtack. Unclaimed improvement structure. Former biological survey cabin. Bogachiel drainage. Access poor. Tax parcel abandoned. No utilities. Unsafe occupancy. Buyer assumes all responsibility. Minimum bid $4 cap. Clerk's office. Clallam County. Removal or rehabilitation required before spring demolition schedule. Most people would have read it as a warning. Luna read it 3 times because the words biological survey cabin seemed to lift from the paper and arrange themselves in the air between her and the shelves. Former. Abandoned. No utilities. Unsafe. The language was exact. An exact language made room for hope because it did not pretend. It did not offer comfort. It offered a fact with edges. She copied the notice into the back of her notebook, including the parcel number, the office hours, and the phrase buyer assumes all responsibility. Then she sat for a long while with her hands tucked beneath her thighs, feeling the $4 in the shoebox as if they had become heavier. At the next table, an old man turned pages with a moistened finger. Rain tapped the library windows with the patience of someone already welcome. The building breathed heat from floor vents. Somewhere in the children's section, a clock clicked forward by 1 minute. Then another, Luna did not imagine rescue. She did not imagine a restored life. She imagined a roof that was hers even if it leaked, a locked door even if the lock was rusted, a floor where she could sleep without being asked to leave before morning. She imagined a condemned room in the forest where nobody wanted anything from her because nobody wanted the room at all. That was enough. She rose before fear could instruct her otherwise. At the copier, she pressed one palm flat against the bulletin board and eased the thumbtack free. The paper tore slightly at the corner, leaving a green half-moon of paper beneath the tack. She folded the ad once, then again, and placed it inside Silas's shoebox beneath the pencil. Outside, Forks lay under a low ceiling of cloud. Water ran along the curb in narrow brown ribbons. Trucks passed with their headlights on, though it was only afternoon. The air smelled of cedar bark, wet asphalt, and wood smoke from chimneys she would never enter. The county office was miles away and open again in the morning. She had no bed for that night, no breakfast promised, and no certainty that a person could buy anything with $4 except a sandwich, a bus fare, or a few hours of not being hungry. Still, Luna began walking toward the road that led out of town, carrying the notice against her chest inside her coat, and for the first time in 6 weeks the rain did not feel as if it were trying to erase her. The first bus left before daylight, carrying 6 passengers, 3 lunch pails, and the gray breath of wet wool. She sat behind the driver with her satchel on her knees, one hand inside it, fingers resting on the folded county notice as if the paper might change its mind and disappear. The windshield wipers moved with a tired certainty, clearing half circles through mist while Highway 101 unrolled between black firs and ditches full of standing water. At every stop, cold air opened the bus like a book. A man with a chainsaw case boarded near Sappho. A woman with 2 grocery bags got off beside a mailbox painted with ducks. Nobody asked where the girl with split shoes was going. The fare carried her part of the way, not all. Near a turnout west of the Bogachiel River, the driver looked at her in the mirror and said, "Not unkindly. This is as far as that ticket takes you." She thanked him and stepped down into rain that had no drops large enough to name. It simply occupied the air. The bus pulled away with a sigh of brakes and diesel, leaving her beside the road at 7:12 in the morning, 38 degrees by the bank sign she had seen 10 minutes before in town. The cold entered through the cracked side of her shoe and settled between her toes. She walked 9 miles by the road shoulder, because walking was the only bargain still open to her. Gravel clicked under her soles. Trucks dragged wind against her coat. Sword ferns grew at the edge of the ditches, holding beads of water along each serrated leaf, and every stump wore a soft crown of moss as if the forest had been slowly forgiving the saws for generations. By noon, her socks were wet through. At a hay barn off a side lane, where a gate hung crooked from one hinge and no house stood within sight, she stepped inside only long enough to warm her hands under her arms. The barn held the dry, dusty sweetness of stored grass, mouse droppings, old twine, and boards that had known many winters. She had slept in a barn before and understood the manners of it. Take no more room than needed. Touch nothing hung on nails. Leave before any owner has to decide what kind of person you are. That night, when the rain hardened and the temperature fell to 34 degrees, she returned to the same barn because there was nowhere else. She curled behind 3 low bales with her satchel beneath her head and her boots tucked under her coat so they would not grow colder away from her body. The dark was full of small, careful sounds. A mouse in straw. A drip at the far eave. A loose piece of tin tapping once. Then waiting. Then tapping again. She did not sleep deeply. Hunger had a way of sharpening every nail in the wood. In the morning, she brushed hay from her skirt, folded the county notice smooth against her knee, and kept walking. Forks appeared slowly, not as a town announced by grandeur, but as a place that had learned to stand in rain without complaint. First came the tire shop with its stacked black circles shining wet beside the garage doors. Then the motel with vacancies spelled in red bulbs under a cedar shake awning. Then Forks Outfitters, its windows lit pale and practical, carts gathered beneath an overhang. Across the road stood a coffee stand painted a cheerful yellow that seemed almost brave under the clouds. Farther on, a thrift store displayed rubber boots, chipped mugs, and a child's wooden chair in the window. Beyond it, the pharmacy sign blinked between raindrops, and a diner sent the smell of frying onions and coffee into the damp morning. She paused outside the diner longer than she meant to. Through the window, a waitress refilled a man's cup and laughed at something he said, leaning one hand on the booth as if time were generous. Plates moved beneath heat lamps. A cook wiped his forehead with his sleeve. Steam lifted from a bowl of oatmeal at the counter. The ordinary world went on feeding itself. She took one breath, then another, and turned away before her body could make a plea her pride would have to answer. The county clerk's office occupied a modest annex beside the West End service building, a low structure with beige siding, a flag damp against its pole, and a ramp edged with wet cedar needles. A typed notice on the glass door listed licensing hours, tax payments, property records, marriage forms, and surplus improvements. The door handle was cold enough to make her fingers stiffen. Inside, the air smelled of toner, floor wax, and paper stored longer than people remembered. Fluorescent lights hummed softly above a counter divided by sliding glass. A rack of pamphlets leaned near the wall, flood maps, burn permits, septic rules, voter registration, emergency preparedness. The floor had been mopped recently, but mud still marked the path from the door to the counter in brown half-moons. She stood on the mat until the woman behind the glass looked up. The clerk was in her late 60s, maybe older, with hair the color of pewter drawn into a roll at the back of her head. Her face had the weathered fairness of someone born near salt water and never truly away from it. Reading glasses hung from a beaded chain around her neck, and a navy cardigan lay over her shoulders, though the room was warm. On the desk before her sat a brass nameplate darkened at the edges. MRS. Hattie Bellingham.
Skanky Clerk, West End Desk.
The woman's hands were broad and precise. She wore no rings except a plain band worn thin enough that it had become part of her finger. When she slid open the glass, the sound was dry and official. "Can I help?" Luna placed the folded notice on the counter and smoothed it with both palms. She did not say too much. Too much invited questions, and questions required a place in the world from which to answer. "I came about the biological survey cabin." The clerk's eyes moved from the notice to Luna's face, then to her shoes, then back to the notice. Something passed through her expression. Not pity, not quite warning, but the careful inward movement of a person deciding whether plain speech would be kinder than gentleness. "That parcel, Mrs." Bellingham said, "has been on the nuisance list a long while." "Yes." "Mom. You understand there is no water service." "Yes." "Mom. No power. No maintained access. No county road beyond the gravel turnoff." "Yes." "Mom. You understand the structure is condemned for occupancy." "Yes." "Mom. And if you sign, you assume the cost of repair, removal, injury, trespass, fire, rot, animals, weather, and whatever else is waiting there." "Yes." "Mom. The clerk removed her glasses and let them hang against her cardigan. She leaned back slightly, and the chair gave a small metal complaint. "You understand," she said again. "Slower now. The county is not selling you land in the ordinary sense. The land is tax-abandoned. And this paper concerns the improvement structure and salvage responsibility. You are accepting a burden most grown contractors would not want." "Yes. Mom. Mrs." Bellingham was silent long enough for the fluorescent hum to become visible in the room. Outside the glass door, rain ran down the flagpole. A delivery truck backed somewhere behind the building with 3 distant beeps. "You have identification." Luna slid her state ID under the gap in the glass. The clerk read it, then looked once more at her face. This time, her eyes caught on the surname. The change was quiet, but Luna saw it. A little stillness. A small adjustment of the mouth. "Wren, Mrs." Bellingham said. Luna waited. "There used to be a Wren who did specimen work down around Gray's Harbor," the clerk continued. "Pressed plants. Birds under glass. School displays. My youngest saw a fox kit he prepared in a museum room before they shut it down. Gentle work. Careful." Luna's hand closed around the edge of the counter. "He was my uncle." The clerk lowered the ID. For a moment, her official manner loosened, and the woman behind it looked out with a sorrow that had manners enough not to intrude. "I thought there was a resemblance," she said. No one had said that to Luna before. She did not know what part of her face had carried him forward. Perhaps the way she held still. Perhaps the way she looked at an object before touching it. The thought moved through her and took its place without asking to be named. "Mrs." Bellingham turned away and opened a file cabinet. The drawer slid out with a metal rumble. She searched by tab, removed a manila folder, then set it on the counter as if it contained something more fragile than forms. There was a biological survey station out that way in the 40s and 50s, she said. Small private effort first. Then a grant, then nothing regular. County took notice only after the roof started showing from the access track. "We have photographs if you need discouragement." "I do not," Luna said. The clerk almost smiled. The paperwork took 26 minutes. "Mrs." Bellingham explained each page before she slid it through the gap. There was an assumption of risk, a salvage transfer, a tax parcel note, a county demolition hold, a handwritten receipt, and a statement acknowledging that no warranty, habitability, or access was promised. The pen was attached to the counter with a silver chain. Luna had to press hard because the ink skipped twice. When the payment line came, she unfolded the 4 bills beneath the counter before placing them flat on the glass tray. They looked smaller there, under fluorescent light, than they had looked in the shoebox. "Mrs." Bellingham counted them without comment. Then she opened a drawer, removed a receipt book, and wrote slowly. The stamp sat near her right elbow, a heavy brass instrument with a black handle polished by decades of clerks. She positioned the paper, checked the date, then pressed the stamp down with both hands. It landed with a solemn weight that seemed too large for the room. Received. Filed. Transferred. The words appeared in blue ink, exact and slightly uneven at the edges. "Mrs." Bellingham tore the receipt along the perforation and slid it beneath the glass. Then she did something that did not belong to procedure. She held the 4 bills a moment, folded them once, and placed them not in the cash drawer but beneath a stone paperweight shaped like an otter. "For morning deposit," she said, though no one had asked. She brought out a county map printed on heavy paper and turned it so Luna could see. A red pencil marked Highway 101, the Bogachiel River, a spur past an overgrown survey gate, and a dotted line almost lost among contour marks. "You will go south out of town," she said. Tapping with the pencil. "Stay on 101 until you pass the state park entrance. There is an older roadbed past the second, not signed anymore. Locals still call it Alder Spur. If you reach the bridge with green rails, you have gone too far. The first half-mile is gravel. After that, you walk. Keep the drainage on your left until the ground rises. If you see an abandoned pump housing with a cedar growing through the roof, you are close." Luna watched the pencil move and stored every word. "You will cross private frontage before the old county line, Mrs." Bellingham added, "Madsen Place to the east. He has a brown dog that barks and does not bite unless frightened. Do not cut through his shed yard. Stay by the walnut trees." "Walnut trees," Luna repeated. "2 of them. Strange place for walnuts. But they are there. Planted by somebody stubborn. After the second tree, you will see a split rail fence down in the salal. The cabin sits beyond that, closer to the creek than it should." She folded the map once, then hesitated. "Do you have "No. Mom." The clerk's lips pressed together. She did not insult Luna by offering disbelief. "That is a long walk." "Yes. Mom. You have a place tonight?" Luna looked down at the receipt. The blue stamp had bled slightly into the paper fibers. "I have the cabin. Mrs." Bellingham did not correct her. Instead, she turned to a drawer, removed a pencil, sharpened it with a small metal sharpener, and placed it beside the map. "Then take this. Mark your turns. The woods have a way of making people certain in the wrong direction." Luna's throat worked once before sound came. "Thank you." "Do not thank me for a pencil," the clerk said. And then, softer, "But keep it dry." Outside, the rain had thinned to a mist that beaded on her sleeves. She stood under the annex overhang and looked at the receipt, the map, and the pencil, trying to understand the shape of ownership when it fit inside one wet hand. Nothing in her body believed it yet. Not fully. A counter, a stamp, a clerk's voice, 4 bills gone from the world, and suddenly there was a place waiting on paper with her name attached to its ruin. The walk south took her past the businesses that had seemed ordinary an hour before and now appeared to belong to another country. The yellow coffee stand, the diner, the pharmacy, the thrift store with the child's chair, Forks Outfitters, where people came out carrying feed sacks, tarps, batteries, milk, nails, dog food, bread. She stood at the edge of the parking lot a moment because the automatic doors opened and released warmth each time someone passed through. A man in a rain jacket came out with a box of roofing screws under one arm. A mother helped a little boy into a truck, lifting him by the waist while he carried a paper bag with both hands. A teenage cashier stepped outside to empty a trash can and gave Luna one quick look. Not unkind. Not lingering. Luna kept moving. Highway 101 bent through wet timber. The shoulder narrowed after the last cluster of buildings, and she walked facing traffic, stepping into grass whenever trucks approached. Ferns brushed her skirt. The rainforest began to close around the road in layers: alder, hemlock, spruce, maple, moss, water, shadow. Every surface held another surface. Bark grew lichen. Lichen held droplets. Droplets reflected a sky the color of pewter. After 4 miles, Her right heel opened again. She sat on a culvert and removed her shoe. The sock had rubbed thin and pink at the blister. She tore a strip from the hem of her spare shirt and wrapped it carefully, tying the cloth flat so it would not bunch under the sole. A raven spoke from somewhere above the road, its voice rough and knowing. She drank from a ditch only after finding a place where water ran clear over stones, cupping it upstream of the mud, because thirst can make a person humble and exact at once. At the state park entrance, a wooden sign stood dark with rain. A family in a green SUV turned in, windshield wipers flashing, bicycles mounted on the back. Luna remained on the highway. She watched for the second bend, then the green-railed bridge she was not supposed to reach. Before the bridge came a break in the trees, narrow enough to miss, where gravel had been swallowed along both edges by salmonberry canes. Alder Spur. No sign remained. Only two rotting posts leaned apart, as if a gate had once stood between them and grown tired of its duty. She stepped off the highway, and the sound of traffic faded almost at once. The gravel road was not a road so much as a memory of one. Rain had cut channels down the middle. Alder leaves lay pasted to stones. Young hemlocks leaned inward from both sides, their branch tips sweeping her shoulders. After the first half-mile, the gravel thinned into mud, then root, then a track of flattened grass and old wheel ruts filled with brown water. She kept the drainage on her left, as instructed. It moved beside her under skunk cabbage leaves and fallen branches, sometimes visible, sometimes only a sound, a cold little grammar of trickles and drops. Once, a deer lifted its head from a screen of salmonberry, ears wide, and watched her pass with no alarm. The air smelled of cedar rot, wet soil, and the green, peppery breath of crushed fern. The first house she saw was barely a house at all from the track, only a roofline beyond a field and a chimney sending up thin smoke. A blue tarp covered one side of a shed. Near it, a brown dog began barking with the bored authority of an animal who knew his boundaries and expected strangers to know them, too. He ran along a fence line, tail high, voice deep. Luna stopped with both hands visible. "I'm staying by the trees," she said quietly. The dog barked 3 more times, then sneezed, shook rain from his ears, and stood watching. Beyond the Madsen place, the ground dipped, and the first walnut appeared. It did not belong there in any easy way. Its black limbs reached through moss and mist with the wide, crooked patience of an orchard tree that had outlived the orchard. The leaves had mostly fallen, leaving a scatter of yellow-brown hands on the ground. A second walnut stood farther on, thicker in the trunk, with one low branch braced like an arm against the rain. Around their roots, salal and swordfern crowded close, but the trees held their own small clearing, as if remembering sun. She passed between them. The split-rail fence lay beyond, just as Mrs. Bellingham had said, though only 3 rails remained high enough to name. The rest had settled into moss. A rusted strand of wire ran through blackberry canes. Luna stepped over it, caught her skirt, freed it carefully, and entered the last stretch of timber. At first she saw only shadow. Then the cabin gathered itself out of the green. It was compact, perhaps 22 feet wide and 30 feet deep, built of cedar boards weathered nearly silver beneath curtains of moss. The foundation stones had sunk unevenly, lowering one corner toward the wet ground. The roof was steep, cedar-shaked, patched long ago with tin near the chimney and now softened into a bowed line. A brick chimney rose from the left side, blackened at the top, with 2 courses missing near the crown. Under the front eave hung a sign so dark with age that the carved letters were nearly lost. Bogachiel Field Station. Natural History Survey. Beneath the words, someone had carved a small fern frond and a bird in profile. The front porch was little more than 3 planks, one broken, one missing, one furred with moss. A window to the right of the door had no glass, only a rectangle of darkness and a curtain of spider silk. The door itself was cedar, swollen in its frame, with a rusted latch and a hasp that had once held a padlock. The padlock lay in the mud below, open and orange with age. For a while, Luna did not approach. She stood under the dripping hemlocks with rain running from her hair into her collar, looking at the building nobody had wanted enough to save. It did not look welcoming. It did not look safe. It looked patient in the way abandoned things become patient when people have stopped promising them anything. Finally, she crossed the small clearing. The porch plank gave under her first step, not breaking, but bending with a wet groan. She shifted her weight to the threshold stone. The door resisted when she lifted the latch. She pressed her shoulder against it once. Then again. On the third try, swollen wood tore loose from the jamb with a long inward scrape, and the cabin opened. The smell came first. Mold, cedar, mouse nests, dust, damp ash, old paper, and something faintly animal. Not fresh, not foul, simply the preserved ghost of feathers and fur. Cold air moved out past her face. Inside, light entered through the broken window and through 3 thin seams in the roof, falling in gray bars across the front room. She waited at the threshold until her eyes adjusted. The front room had been both office and living space. A narrow iron stove stood on a square of cracked stone to the left, its pipe rising crookedly into the chimney. A table sat beneath the front window, its top furred with dust and scattered with mouse-chewed paper. 2 chairs remained, one upright, one on its side. Shelves lined the wall opposite the stove, sagging under field guides, jars without labels, rolled maps tied with brittle string, and a row of empty glass specimen vials reflecting what little light the room allowed. The floorboards were cedar, dark from damp near the door and pale where a rug had once lain. In the corner, a nest of blackberry cane had grown through a gap in the wall and reached toward the center of the room like a hand that had been left waiting too long. She stepped inside. The board beneath her left foot complained sharply. She stopped, shifted, then tested the next board with the toe of her shoe. Silas had taught her that rooms spoke before they failed. She moved slowly, listening. One board near the stove dipped. Another near the table was sound. The air was cold enough that her breath showed faintly. In the back room, the ceiling sloped lower. This had been the workroom. Even in decay, she knew it by arrangement. A long bench ran beneath a high window filmed with algae. Above it hung a rack of tools, many missing, their outlines pale against the wall where dust had not settled. Shallow drawers stood beneath the bench, each with a brass pull green by time. A cabinet with glass doors occupied the rear wall, and inside it stood a great diorama case nearly as wide as a bed. The case stopped her. It was made of cedar and glass, taller than her shoulder, built with the care of someone who intended the forest to be carried indoors without being conquered. Inside, behind streaked glass, a barred owl stood on a branch above painted ferns, paper fungi, twigs, stones, and a painted creek no wider than a ribbon. The owl's wings were folded. Its round face turned slightly left. Dust softened the stripes of its feathers, but the posture remained exact, grave, and waiting. Luna moved closer without touching the glass. The eyes were amber. One had clouded. Still, the bird seemed to see not her face, but the line of road behind her, the barn night, the clerk's counter, the porch in rain, all of it carried into the room and set down at last. She looked away first. The back room held other things, too. A rusted basin, a stool with one leg repaired in a different wood, bundles of plant presses tied in cord, their boards warped but present, a broken lamp, a stack of newspapers from years too blurred to read, a tin cup on the floor, a blue enamel coffee pot with no lid. Against one wall, a narrow cot frame stood without a mattress, the springs red with rust. No bed, no blanket, no food. But there was a roof, even if it leaked. There were walls, even if one leaned. There was a door that could be wedged shut with the fallen chair. There was a room where her breathing belonged to no one else's schedule. She returned to the front room and worked before darkness could make the decisions harder. She dragged the broken chair to the door and braced it beneath the latch. She pulled the blackberry cane loose from the wall, inch by inch, until thorns opened 3 thin lines across her wrist. She did not curse. She wrapped the cuts with the same strip of shirt she had used for her heel after rinsing it in rainwater. From the shelves, she removed a stack of mold-soft papers and laid them under the worst drip, so the floor would not puddle. She turned the upright chair upside down and shook mouse droppings from the seat. She found a broom in the workroom, handle cracked but usable, and swept a space near the stove with patient strokes, moving dust, cedar flakes, beetle shells, and dead leaves into a mound by the door. Outside, evening lowered without color. The forest did not darken all at once. It thickened. The windows became gray, then pewter, then black glass holding the small reflection of her own movement. She found no matches, no lamp oil. The stove was cold, its firebox filled with old ash and fragments of bird nests that had fallen down the pipe. She would not risk a fire until she knew whether the chimney drew or burned. Careful work teaches the hand to tell the truth. She did not speak the sentence aloud. She worked by it. For supper, there was nothing. She drank rainwater caught in the enamel coffee pot after wiping it 3 times with the lining of her coat. The water tasted of metal, cedar, and sky. When she could no longer see well enough to clean, she opened the satchel and removed the shoebox. The cardboard had softened at one corner but held. She placed it on the swept floor beside the wall farthest from the drips. Then she removed the pencil, the folded notice, the stamped receipt, and the county map. One by one, she set them on the floor in a line, as if arranging specimens. Outside, the drainage creek spoke in the dark. Somewhere near the walnut trees, the brown dog barked once, then gave up. Rain moved over the roof in 1,000 fine touches. A drop struck the metal stove every few seconds with a small hollow note. Luna lay down in her coat, knees drawn close, satchel beneath her head, shoebox against her stomach. The floor was hard. Cold rose through the boards steadily, but no one told her to move. No porch light snapped off behind her. No clerk warned her again. No guest calendar claimed the room. The cabin had been waiting, and so had she. Morning entered through the broken window as a pale square, and the first thing she did was listen for water. Not rain. Not the creek. Water she could use. The cabin had taught her its first lesson in darkness, and it was that a roof did not have to be whole to become a kind of mercy. Now daylight asked for other agreements. The room was colder than the barn had been because cedar held the night inside it, But the floor beneath her was dry where she had swept, and the shoebox had not softened further. She rose slowly, joints stiff, heel tender, hands smelling of dust and old cedar, and set about learning what the place would allow. The well stood 27 paces behind the back door, half hidden by salmonberry and a fallen alder limb gone furred with moss. A round concrete collar rose from the ground, cracked on one side, with a wooden lid weighted by 2 stones. The rope had rotted. The pulley hung above it like an idle question. She did not drink from it that morning. She lifted the lid only a handbreadth and smelled cold stone, iron, and deep water, then covered it again because thirst was safer than carelessness. The outhouse stood farther upslope, square and leaning, its crescent moon cutout clogged with spider silk. She opened the door with a branch and waited while 2 moths lifted themselves from the darkness. Inside, the bench was sound, the pit capped with an old lime scatter, and a chipped enamel pail sat in the corner beside a folded newspaper whose date had blurred into gray. It was not comfort. It was order. Order mattered. By noon, she knew the front room floor had 4 boards that could be trusted, 3 that could be crossed only near the joists, and 1 near the stove that flexed like wet cardboard. She marked the weak places with scraps of torn paper weighted by pebbles. In the back room, the bench leg had sunk through a soft plank, and the corner near the great display case smelled sharper than the rest, as if water had crept into the wall and slept there for years. She spent the first day on dry work. She opened drawers without forcing them, using the clerk's pencil as a wedge when the brass pulls would not move. She shook mouse nests from an empty flour tin, cleared leaves from the threshold, and carried 3 armloads of rotten paper to a sheltered place beneath the eave. Not burning them, not yet. Every object was handled as if it might have one honest use left. A jar could hold rainwater. A splintered shelf-board could cover a hole. A cracked basin could catch drips. A rusted lid could become a marker for the path. The second day, she tested the creek in the well. The creek ran clear over stones where it narrowed below a cedar root, so she filled the enamel pot there, then carried the water back with both hands cupped around its sides. At the well, she found a coil of newer nylon cord in a shed corner under blackberry cane, bright blue beneath a layer of dirt. She tied it to the bucket frame after checking the knots 3 times. The bucket came up half full, cold and brown at first, then clearer after 2 more draws. She let sediment settle, poured the top layer into jars, and set them in a row beneath the back window. On the 3rd morning, she walked the cabin in socks so she could hear it properly. Shoes lied. Bare boards told the truth through the skin. The floor creaked differently near rot than near age. A safe board gave 1 dry note. A dangerous board answered with a dull softness, as if the sound had nowhere to travel. She learned the path from door to stove, stove to table, table to back room to well bucket. She learned where the roof dripped after steady rain and where it only wept when wind came from the west. Hunger made her movements slow, but not careless. By late afternoon, she had to go into town. A room, even one given by ruin, could not be kept by gratitude alone. It required nails, fire, food, and a way to mend what weather had already begun to unmake. She counted what remained in the shoebox after the payment was gone, the stamped receipt, the folded notice, the map, the pencil, Silas's pencil, and nothing that could be spent. There was one thing she did have, the county transfer paper. It was not money, but it was proof that she belonged somewhere on record. For 1 hour of her life, that would have to be enough. The walk back to town took longer than the walk out because her body had begun to understand the weight of being underfed. The brown dog barked as before, but with less conviction, and she lifted one hand to him without stopping. At the highway, mist opened and closed over the road. Twice, passing trucks threw spray high enough to wet her skirt to the knees. She reached Forks near 4 in the afternoon, when the storefront lights had already come on and the whole town seemed to be bracing itself for evening rain. The hardware store stood between a feed supplier and a laundromat, under a faded green sign that read Haskell Hardware and Supply. The front windows were crowded with axe handles, rain gauges, stovepipe elbows, gloves, mason jars, mouse traps, paint scrapers, and a cardboard display of pocket knives locked behind plastic. When she opened the door, a bell rang overhead with a worn, exact sound. Heat met her first, then the smell oiled metal, cedar shavings, rubber boots, twine, fertilizer, coffee burned too long on a back counter, and the mineral odor of damp men coming in from work. A narrow aisle ran past bins of nails sold by the pound. The floorboards were painted brown, worn to bare wood in the center path. Above the register hung 3 fly rods, a mounted steelhead, and a calendar showing a tractor in clean sunlight from some other state. The man behind the counter was not large, but he seemed built out of useful angles. He had a square jaw, white eyebrows, and a scar that cut through one eyebrow and stopped above the cheekbone. His hands were thick at the knuckles, with one thumbnail blackened halfway back from an old injury. A tape measure rode on his belt. His flannel shirt was buttoned to the throat. He looked up from repairing a kerosene lantern. "What can I do for you?" She placed the transfer paper on the counter, the way she had placed the notice before the clerk. It had already become a habit, offering paper in exchange for the right to be heard. "I need to make the field station habitable enough to keep the demolition hold," she said. The man stared at the paper, then at her. "You bought the Bogachiel Station?" "Yes, sir." "For $4. She did not answer, because he was not asking. He picked up the paper, read it carefully, and set it down with one finger still on the county stamp. His face did not change much, but the hand with the blackened nail tapped once on the counter. "I am Emmett Haskell," he said. "That building should have fallen in 10 years ago." "It has not. That is not the same as being sound." "No, sir." He studied her again. Not her torn hem this time, or her wet sleeves, but her eyes, and perhaps the way she stood without leaning on the counter, though she had every reason to lean. "You have tools?" "No, sir." "No, sir." "Experience. Some careful work. Not construction." He gave a short breath through his nose. It was not laughter. It was closer to a man setting down one truth and picking up another. "Careful keeps your fingers attached," he said. "It does not square a roof." "No, sir." The lantern on the counter had its glass chimney removed, wick exposed. He turned the wick wheel with a thumb and watched it rise, then sink. "I do not run charity accounts." "I understand. I do run local accounts when there is collateral, work history, or somebody willing to stand behind the debt. I have the cabin. That is not collateral. That is the debt-wearing boards." She lowered her eyes to the counter's edge, where years of purchases had nicked the varnish into pale lines. "Then I should not have taken your time." She reached for the paper, but he kept one finger on it. "What do you need?" She looked up. "Chimney brush, stove pipe wire, work gloves." A small pry bar if there is a used one. Nails. Tar paper. Maybe. Food would be from somewhere else. He turned away and lifted a ledger from beneath the counter. It was wide and cloth-bound, with alphabetical tabs softened by use. Name. She gave it. She hesitated only a moment. Bogachiel Field Station. He wrote that down without lifting his head. Terms are 30 days, he said. After 30 days, I come out and see whether you have been foolish or deliberate. If deliberate, I extend. If foolish, I stop. If you break tools, you pay. If you return tools clean, I remember. She nodded once. He opened a drawer, removed a booklet with a curled cover, and placed it beside the ledger. The title read Basic Homestead Repairs. Roof, stove, floor, window. Well, the edges were foxed. A coffee ring marked the first page. Free, he said. It is out of date, but gravity has not changed. Her hands went to the booklet before she could stop them. She touched only the corner. Thank you. Do not thank me yet. Read before you climb, and do not make fire until you know the flue is open. Creosote burns hotter than sense. He moved through the store with a pencil tucked behind his ear and a cardboard tray in one hand. From a bin he weighed out nails, 1 pound of 8-penny common nails at 2.19 cents,
Half a pound of 4-penny finish nails at $1.42,
and 6 12-penny spikes at 19 cents each. He found a used flat pry bar with red paint worn from the heel, marked down to $3.50. A pair of canvas work gloves with one loose cuff went into the tray for $4.75. A round wire chimney brush, 6-inch, $8.90. 2 lengths of fiberglass rod, $3.20 each. A roll of stove gasket wire, $2.60. A black stove brush, $1.95. A tin of stove cement, 5.40 cents. A packet of safety matches, 89 cents. A small sack of cornmeal, $1.25. A tin of beans, $1.10. Oatmeal in a paper tube, 2.35. Salt, 49 cents. 1 dented enamel mug from a clearance shelf, 35 cents. At the last aisle, he stopped and looked at the roof patching materials. You cannot afford felt. I cannot afford anything, she said. That is accurate. He cut a 12-foot length from a damaged roll of 15-pound roofing felt and marked it as scrap. $2,000. Then he added a handful of roofing caps from an open box and wrote no charge beside them, though his pencil remained stern. The total came to $49. He wrote it in the ledger under her name with the date, then turned the book so she could sign. The pen in her hand trembled only after she had finished writing. Emmett packed the smaller things into a paper sack and tied the brush rods with twine. He wrapped the pry bar in old newspaper so it would not tear the sack. At the door, he called after her. Creosote looks like black glass if it is hardened. Do not breathe more of it than you must. Yes, sir. And if the pipe is cracked, you do not light that stove. No, sir. She carried the hardware against her chest all the way back, stopping twice under cedar boughs to rest the weight on a stump. By the time she reached the cabin, the afternoon had begun to dim, and the front room received her like an unheeded hand. She did not cook that night. Emmett's warning held. The chimney took the next day and half of the one after. She began by clearing the stove. With the new gloves on, she opened the firebox and removed old ash 1 flat scoop at a time with a piece of cedar bark, transferring it into the cracked basin. Beneath the ash were 2 dead beetles, a mouse skull as delicate as a seed husk, and a nail bent into a hook. She checked the stove body with her fingers, feeling for cracks along the sides and around the door. Rust flaked beneath her touch, but the iron held. The pipe rose from the stove in 3 sections before entering the wall thimble and chimney. She tapped each section with the handle of the pry bar. The first rang dull but whole. The second gave a faint rattle. The third, near the ceiling, had a seam open no wider than a fingernail. She marked it with chalk from a drawer and made a note in the booklet's margin. Seam high. Patch before winter. Outside, she studied the chimney from the ground. 2 top courses were loose. Moss grew between bricks near the crown. A fern had rooted in the mortar on the north side, small and bright, an innocent thing in the wrong place. She would not climb the roof yet. The roof was not ready for her weight. So she worked from below. She tied the wire brush to the first fiberglass rod, then a cord to the rod's end, exactly as the booklet showed in a line drawing made by someone who believed hands could learn from ink. She spread old paper around the stove opening, wrapped a cloth over her nose and mouth, and pushed the brush up through the pipe. It stopped after 2 feet. She twisted clockwise, then back, then pushed again. Something scraped above her, a dry, resistant sound. When she drew the brush down, black flakes fell into the firebox, shining like broken obsidian. Creosote, hardened in ridges along the pipe. She added the second rod and worked higher, 6 inches at a time, never forcing so hard she might separate a joint she could not reach. For 3 hours, she brushed, withdrew, cleared debris, and brushed again. Her shoulders burned. Soot settled on her hair, her sleeves, the floor, the cloth over her mouth. Twice she had to go outside and breathe beside the creek because the bitterness coated her tongue. She drank water, spat black, and returned. At noon, a wad of bird nest dropped down the pipe with a soft collapse. Twigs, moss, gray feathers, and cedar bark filled the firebox nearly to the lip. She removed it carefully. The feathers were old. No warmth had belonged to them for many seasons. The chimney itself required a different method. She could not reach from the roof, so she opened the clean-out door at the base, a rusted iron square hidden behind a warped board near the wall. The hinge resisted, then gave with a shriek that made her step back. Inside lay a mound of soot and creosote flakes deep enough to bury her hand. She used the enamel mug to scoop it out, then the stove brush, then a rag wrapped around a stick. Each motion brought down more black scale from above. She worked 6 hours that first day and 4 the next morning. When she could pass the brush from stovepipe into flue without meeting the hard stop, she held a scrap of paper at the firebox opening and watched. The paper stirred inward. A draft. Small, but present. The chimney was pulling air. Still, she waited another hour. She checked the pipe seam near the ceiling and pressed stove cement into the opened line with the flat of a broken butter knife found in a drawer. She smoothed the cement deliberately and let it set while she cleaned soot from the stones beneath the stove. Only then did she make the first fire. Not logs. Not even kindling at first. 1 twist of paper. 3 cedar shavings. 2 twigs no thicker than pencils. Dry from beneath the workbench. She struck the match against the packet, and the sound cracked open the room. Sulfur flared. The paper caught, curled, blackened at the edge, then gave its light to the shavings. Flames stood up briefly, thin and golden, a creature unsure it had been invited. She watched the smoke. It lifted, entered the pipe, did not roll back, did not seep from the seam. did not blacken the room. She added 2 more twigs, then a piece of split cedar from the shed wall, dry at the center though silvered outside. The stove ticked as iron warmed. A smell rose, first dust and old ash, then honest heat. She did not cry. Her body simply moved closer before permission was needed. That evening, she cooked cornmeal in the enamel pot with creek water and a pinch of salt. It thickened slowly, catching at the bottom because the pot had a thin place in its enamel. She stirred with a peeled twig. The beans warmed in their tin at the stove edge, label removed so it would not scorch. She ate from the mug with a spoon found in the drawer and cleaned with ash, sand, and boiling water. The meal was plain enough to be almost severe. It filled her. Afterward, with heat still gathering near the stove and rain beginning again on the roof, she turned to the workroom. She made an inventory because naming was a way to keep fear from taking up too much space. Top shelf. Left side 9 field guides, 5 water damage beyond use, 2 bird manuals with pages stuck near the plates, 1 guide to lichens, 1 hand-bound checklist of Olympic Peninsula flora in fading ink, 12 glass jars, 3 cracked, 2 holding cotton plugs, 1 containing a curl of snakeskin, 1 holding a label only, Cassiope mertensiana, 1956. Third shelf, a box of rusted insect pins, a roll of linen tape gone brittle at the edge, 3 glassine envelopes with pressed leaves inside, a tin of borax hardened into 1 white cake, a cracked magnifier, and a folded square of waxed paper. Workbench, left drawer, curved needles, 2 usable, 1 snapped. Line and thread, dry but strong. 3 scalpels without blades. Wooden-handled awl. Brass calipers green at the joint. Small ruler marked in inches and millimeters. Pencil stubs. A cork pinning strip. A bundle of paper labels tied with black thread. Workbench. Middle drawer, plant press straps. Cotton batting. A packet of powdered alum. Broken forceps. A mouse-chewed roll of cotton, and a small envelope of glass eyes wrapped in tissue. The eyes unsettled her until she unfolded the tissue and saw that each pair had been labeled by size. Sparrow, thrush, owl, fox kit. Not trophies. Repairs for likeness. Workbench, right drawer, empty. But the emptiness was too clean. She set that aside in her mind. On the floor beneath the bench, 2 warped plant presses, 1 with brass screws missing, a wooden crate of cedar shavings, 3 boards cut to the same dimension, a folded canvas apron stiff with age, a lantern without oil, a coil of wire, a tin basin, a cracked plaster mold of a bird body, labeled Strix varia, juvenile, rear wall the diorama case. She saved it for last, not because it was largest, but because something in its stillness asked not to be hurried. The case was built deeper than she had first understood. Nearly 3 feet from glass to rear wall, with a cedar frame joined by careful miters and darkened brass screws. The front glass was divided into 3 panels. A painted forest backdrop curved into the corners so there was no hard horizon. Paper ferns had been shaped with a knife and painted in several greens. Real twigs, sealed with varnish, formed understory branches. The barred owl stood on a cedar limb fixed into the back wall. 1 talon visible, 1 hidden by moss. At the base of the case, a small brass plaque had gone dull. Baradol, Strix varia, Bogachiel drain, prepared for field instruction. No date. She wiped the glass with a dry cloth, then with breath, then with the cloth again. Behind the streaks, the owl's face emerged more clearly. round facial discs, dark bars across the chest, feathers laid with skill enough that time had softened but not destroyed the work. The left eye was clouded. The right still held an amber point. Silas would have paused. She did. The anomaly did not appear as a revelation. It arrived as a sound. She was sweeping beneath the case when the broom handle struck the baseboard. Instead of the dull thud of wood against wood, the right side answered with a hollow note, low and brief. She stopped, lifted the broom, and tapped again. Solid on the left. Solid at center. Hollow on the right. She crouched, breathing through her nose to quiet herself, and tapped with one knuckle. The note changed within 6 inches. She removed the lower drawer from the base of the case. It slid out only halfway before sticking. Inside were brittle lesson cards and a scatter of acorn caps, carried in by mice. She emptied them, then lifted the drawer free. Behind it, the cedar backing looked ordinary except for a round disc of wood no larger than a $half, its grain turned opposite the surrounding board. A cedar disc. She pressed it. Nothing. She tried to turn it with her fingers, but the edges were flush. She took the awl from the workbench, hesitated, then wrapped its tip in cloth so she would not scar the wood more than necessary. The disc did not pry. It rotated, barely, after she set the awl against a small notch at the edge and moved it counterclockwise. 1/4 turn. Then another. Something clicked inside the case wall. The sound went through her like cold water. She sat back on her heels and waited, though there was nothing to wait for except the steadiness of her own hands. Outside, rain ticked through salal leaves. The stove in the front room gave one soft metal pop as it cooled. A narrow panel at the rear of the base had loosened. She found the seam by touch, worked the pry bar into it with care, and eased the panel outward. It had been sealed with wax along the edges, not nailed. The wax cracked in pale lines. Cedar dust fell across her hands. Behind the panel lay a dark compartment, deeper than her forearm, lined with oilcloth. At first she saw only packages. She brought the lantern close, though it held no flame, using its glass to catch what little evening light remained from the high window. There were 4 bundles and a tin box, all wrapped with the deliberate patience of someone storing not valuables only, but instructions for a future hand. The first bundle was tied in cotton tape and wrapped in brown oilcloth. She untied rather than cut it. Inside lay tools. Not grand tools, not polished for display, but working instruments chosen by somebody who knew what mattered. A scalpel handle with 3 wrapped blades sealed in wax paper, 2 curved sewing needles in a cork, a bone folder yellowed with use, a pair of fine forceps, a hand lens in a brass ring, a narrow awl with a walnut handle, a pin vise, and a caliper small enough for bird measurements. Each tool had been rubbed with oil before storage. They carried almost no rust. The second bundle held raw material. Line and thread. Cotton batting wrapped in muslin. Small packets labeled alum. Borax. Hide paste. Powdered clay. A folded sheet of handmade paper. Plant mounting strips cut and stacked. A pressed fern between blotters, still green-brown and delicate after years in darkness. At the bottom lay 2 cedar boards for a plant press, miniature in size, with brass screws and wing nuts taped to one side. The third package was flat and stiff. Inside was a map, hand-drawn on heavy paper, the ink brown at the folds but clear. It showed the drainage, the creek, the cabin, the old walnuts, and beyond them a web of careful marks. Beside each mark were names written in a hand that had known both science and kitchen use. Devil's Club. Oregon grape, yarrow, nettle, licorice fern, cascara, plantain, self-heal, red huckleberry, elderflower, and a dozen others. Some had dates beside them. Some had notes about season, bark, root, leaf, ethics of taking, never strip a stand, take only where water is plentiful, leave the first and last, ask the ground twice. She did not understand all of it. She understood enough to know it was not merely a map of plants. It was a map of restraint. The fourth bundle contained cloth, a square of wool, folded around something heavier. When she opened it, a small military medal slid into her palm, dark bronze on a faded ribbon. The date on the back read 1945. There was a name, too, worn but legible under the soot of age. She traced it once with the pad of her thumb, then set it down carefully on the workbench as if it still belonged to a chest. Only then did she open the tin box. It was rectangular, once painted green, now scratched along the corners. The lid had been sealed with a strip of waxed cloth. She peeled it back slowly. The smell inside was dry paper, old metal, and time shut away from damp. On top lay an envelope. It was cream-colored, thick, addressed in brown ink to no single name. My dear one, whoever you are. The words sat in the center of the envelope with calm assurance, as if the writer had known that blood, law, accident, loss, or mercy might bring the right hands eventually. Luna did not open it. Beneath the envelope were bank envelopes, coin rolls, and folded bills bound in narrow paper straps. She lifted them one by one and laid them on the bench in rows. Her hands were exact. Exactness kept her from shaking. The first envelope held $20 bills, mostly old series, counted in straps of 500. The second held tens and fives. The third held ones, many soft as cloth. A smaller envelope held silver certificates. The coin rolls were labeled in pencil, wheat cents, Buffalo nickels, Mercury dimes, Washington quarters, Walking Liberty halves. One paper packet held 3 silver dollars, heavy and cold, dated 1921, 1935, and 1943. Another held loose change, as if someone had emptied an apron pocket and decided even the smallest remainder belonged to the future. She counted once and did not trust herself. She counted again, speaking each total under her breath only as numbers, not as possibility. The bills came to $34,890. The silver certificates added 75. The rolled coins, by face value, added $32.50. The loose coins added $2.23. The 3 silver dollars made 3 more. At the bottom of the tin, inside a folded scrap of paper, lay 1/2 dime so worn its date was nearly gone, counted by the writer as sentimental. No value assigned. She wrote the total with the clerk's pencil on the back of an old lesson card. $35,273. Then she stared at the number until it became marks again. The cabin had gone very still around her, though nothing had changed except what had been uncovered. The roof still leaked. The wall still leaned. Her heel still hurt. The stove still needed tending. There was no mattress, no proper door lock, no certainty beyond the next necessary repair. Yet on the workbench lay enough money to buy a different beginning if a person were willing to abandon the one that had just opened. She folded the bills back into their envelopes. She did not separate the old currency from the newer. She did not put one coin in her pocket. She did not imagine new clothes, a motel, a bus away, a phone, a room with heat, a meal served on a white plate. Those images approached and receded like cars passing in rain. The envelope remained unopened. It was the hardest object not to touch. She placed the tools back on the oilcloth, not hiding them, only arranging them in a line. She set the map under the hand lens to keep it from curling. She laid the metal on the wool square. She closed the tin box but did not seal it. Then she carried the envelope to the front room and set it on the table beneath the broken window, where Dawn would find it before she did. The night asked her to read. She refused it. Not from fear. Not exactly. The day had already given her more than a hungry mind could receive without making a false shape of it. She knew enough about careful work to know when a hand had begun to hurry. A letter that had waited in cedar darkness longer than she had been alive could wait one more night for a reader who was clean, fed, and steady. She built a small fire, no larger than the stove needed, and warmed the last of the beans with cornmeal thinned into porridge. She ate slowly, washed the mug, and banked the embers with ash. Then she put on her coat and went outside. Rain had paused. The forest steamed in the dark, not visibly, but by scent, lifting cedar, soil, fern, and leaf mold into the cold air. The creek behind the cabin moved over stones with a patient silver sound. Clouds had thinned enough for a pale seam of moon to show above the fir tops. Every branch held water. Every drop waited its turn to fall. She walked to the well, then past it, then down toward the drainage where the ground softened beneath her shoes. The map was inside now, the money inside, the letter inside, all of it under the same failing roof that covered her shoebox and the first warm ashes she had made there. For 6 weeks, she had measured life by where she would be allowed to close her eyes. Now the question had changed, and the change was too large to enter all at once. At the creek, she crouched on a stone and watched the water pass over a submerged branch. It divided without argument, silvering around the obstacle, then joined itself again on the other side. Her hands smelled of oilcloth and old coins. She dipped them into the creek until the cold bit her knuckles, then lifted them and let the water run back through her fingers. Somewhere in the timber, an owl called once. Not from the case. Not from memory. A living voice, low and rounded, moving through the trees with its own unhurried authority. The cabin had been waiting, and so had she. At daybreak she washed her hands in water so cold it made the bones ache. She poured from the jar she had left settling through the night, keeping back the last inch where fine brown silt had gathered. The stove accepted one twist of paper and a few cedar splinters, then gave enough heat for a tin cup of water to tremble and steam. She had no soap except a sliver found in the workbench drawer, gray at the edges and cracked with age, but it lathered faintly when she rubbed it between her palms. She cleaned under her nails with the tip of a cedar shaving. She wiped the table twice. She set the tools in a careful row, not because they were needed for reading, but because order steadied the room. The envelope waited beneath the broken window. Dawn had touched it first, just as she had imagined it would. The cream paper had yellowed along the flap, and the ink had browned into the fibers, but the handwriting remained exact. Not elegant. Not ornamental. Exact! Each letter stood upright, with a practical slant at the end of words, as if the writer had often paused between scientific labels and grocery list without changing pens. Luna had seen that hand before. Not the same hand, of course. Not literally. But something in the pressure of the downstrokes and the habit of crossing a T low and firm matched the faded lesson cards, the specimen labels, the pencil notes on the herb map. It also resembled, in a way that entered her body before her mind, the handwriting she had followed in childhood across field notebooks and plant tags. A family hand. A working hand. A hand trained to leave evidence for someone patient enough to read. She sat in the one-sound chair, drew the envelope toward her, and loosened the flap with the bone folder from the hidden bundle. The paste gave reluctantly, then opened without tearing. Inside were 6 folded pages. She unfolded them along their old creases and began. My dear one, whoever you are, if this letter has found you, then either blood has done its quiet work, or mercy has found a road blood could not manage. I will not ask which. A house does not inquire too sharply of the person who opens its door in rain. My name is Miriam Alder Wren, born in 1898 in Port Townsend, Washington Territory only in the stories my mother told, for by my birth the state had already learned its new name. My father was Thomas Alder, son of Elias Alder, who came west from Vermont in 1859 with 2 plant presses, a Bible, and a tin of apple seeds that did not prosper in this wet country. Elias married Ruth Kestrel, whose mother was Clallam and whose father came from a Hudson's Bay post near Fort Nisqually. Their daughter, Ruthie Alder, married my father's father. Jonah Wren, a cabinet maker from Maine who could make a drawer slide true in any season. From them came my father, Thomas, and from Thomas came me, Miriam. I married Samuel Wren in 1919, in a courthouse room that smelled of coal smoke and damp wool, and took the Wren name as one takes a tool that fits the hand. We were not wealthy people. We were keepers of small exact things. Plants pressed flat so a child might learn a leaf. Birds prepared after window strike or winter death so a classroom could see the architecture of feathers. Bark, seed, bone, nest, claw, moss, fungus, weather, creekstone, field note. These were our trade, though trade is too grand a word for work that mostly paid in eggs, flour, stove wood, and gratitude spoken awkwardly by schoolteachers. The work closed on November 14, 1958. I write the date because dates matter. That morning the county school board voted to remove the natural history cases from 3 schools after a child's mother called them morbid and unsanitary. By afternoon, the new science supplier from Seattle had offered bright plastic models and glossy charts. By evening, our last standing order was canceled. I do not blame the mother. She had buried a son the year before and could not bear glass eyes. Grief often condemns the wrong object because the right one cannot be reached. After that date, I kept the station alone for more than 30 years. Samuel had died in the influenza winter after the First War, though he had survived the trenches in France only to come home and be taken by his own lungs. My brother Caleb was killed in the Argonne in 1918. My son Aaron enlisted in the Navy and was lost in the Pacific in 1945. His ship struck near Okinawa. 3 wars touched this family by name or by shadow, and still the ferns opened each spring with no ceremony at all. That is not indifference. It is instruction. I have written these pages because Dr. Helen Markham at Swedish Hospital in Seattle has told me the growth in my lungs is not one she can cut away. She was gentle and plain, which is the best a physician can be. I have some months, perhaps less if winter is hard. I do not intend to spend them arguing with death. I intend to put things in order. If you mean to restore the craft, begin smaller than pride wishes. For plant pressing, cut blotters clean and change them after the first 12 hours. Then each day for a week in wet weather. Keep the press near steady warmth, not above 95 degrees, never in direct stove heat. For fleshy stems, split them lengthwise and remove pith, or they will blacken before they dry. A mounting paste of wheat starch in water, 1 part starch to 4 parts water, cooked until translucent and cooled before use, will hold better than store glue and fail more kindly if a future hand must lift it. For bird work, take only what death has already released. Measure before skinning bill, wing cord, tarsus, tail, weight if possible, and place found. Borax with a pinch of alum will dry a small skin. Use cotton lightly. A body overfilled lies. A body underfilled apologizes. Neither is faithful. Set wings with linen thread and pins, then leave under paper in a dry cabinet for 10 days. Longer when the rain is stubborn. Never hurry the eyes. The eyes are the last courtesy. For herb gathering, do not strip roots from a patch unless the patch is broad enough to forget you were there. Leaves before flower, bark when sap runs, roots after seed. Dry nettle at 100 degrees or less. Devil's club bark must be scraped with gloves. Never boiled hard. Oregon grape root stains everything yellow and teaches humility. Label each packet with place, date, weather, and your reason for taking. A remedy without a record is only a rumor. There is money here, though money is the least living thing I leave. Use it slowly. Use it for the roof before comfort, the chimney before pride, glass before curtains, tools before ornaments. Do not let sudden provision make you careless. Sudden provision has ruined more people than want ever did. Want at least keeps a person awake. Inheritance is not ownership extended backward. It is a question placed in the hands of the living. Will you keep what kept you? Will you learn the names of things before using them? Will you leave one shelf, one drawer, one honest page for somebody whose face you cannot imagine? If you are kin, I greet you. If you are a stranger, I greet you no less. The careful are kin to each other in a country that forgets them. This place was never meant to be impressive. It was meant to be useful, and usefulness is a holy form of welcome. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Miriam Alder Wren, Bogachiel Field Station, February 3, 1989. Luna read the letter once without moving except to turn the pages. Then she read it again. The second reading entered more slowly. Certain sentences did not reveal themselves the first time, because astonishment had stood in front of them. She saw now the steadiness of a woman writing with a diagnosis in her chest and winter outside the wall. She saw the 4 generations not as a family tree, but as hands passing a narrow tool across weather. War, schoolrooms, kitchens, and field paths. She saw grief refusing spectacle. She saw the exactness of somebody who had hidden provision without making it into a temptation. When she finished, she placed the pages on the table and rested both hands on either side of them. The cabin made its ordinary sounds around her. A drip in the pail. The stove ticking. The creek beyond the wall. A raven somewhere high. Nothing had become louder, and that was what made the words believable. She folded the letter along its original creases, not new ones. The paper resisted slightly at the old bends, then accepted them. She slid the pages back into the envelope, but did not close the flap. Closed things had done enough waiting. On the final page, near the bottom, one line had been added after the signature in smaller writing, as if the writer had set the letter aside, then returned before sealing it. If the walnut still stands, look behind the horseshoe. Luna carried the page to the back door and stood there while the sentence arranged itself with the map of the place in her mind. The walnut, the stubborn trees beyond the Madsen dog, the two trunks holding their clearing among the salal. She put on her coat, tucked the open envelope inside it, and stepped out. Morning had softened into a wet, windless hour. The forest floor received her without echo. She followed the faint path past the well, past the outhouse, through salmonberry and sword fern, then between the fallen rails toward the older of the two walnut trees. Up close, the trunk was larger than it had seemed in rain, its bark ridged and dark, its branches bare against the winter sky. Moss climbed the north side. A few leaves still clung near the top, brown and curled like hands closing around sleep. The horseshoe was not visible at first. She circled once, then again, pushing wet fern aside with her boot. On the far side, shoulder-high, nearly swallowed by bark that had grown around it, a rusted horseshoe curved out from the trunk. The iron had gone black and orange. Two old square nails still held it, though the tree had taken most of their length into itself. Behind the arch of the shoe, set into a narrow hollow, was a slate marker no larger than her palm. She wiped it with her sleeve. M. A. W. Keeper of the Small Things, 1898-1989. No cemetery stone in a public row. No polished granite. Just a slate marker in a walnut tree, protected by iron, rain, bark, and whatever eyes still knew to look. Luna stood with one hand against the trunk. The bark was wet and cold. Beneath it, not felt but known, the tree was alive in its winter way, holding its rings around nail. Metal, name, and years. She did not say anything. Speech would have reduced the moment. Some silences are not empty. They are rooms the living enter with their heads bowed. At the base of the tree, half buried in leaf mold, lay a shard of blue glass, a strip of rusted tin, and a walnut shell opened neatly by some animal with better teeth than hers. She picked up the shell and placed it in her pocket. Not as a relic, as a reminder that even a hard casing had a seam. Back inside, the cabin seemed altered only because she had been altered by what she now knew how to notice. The field guides were not clutter. The labels were not scraps. The owl was not merely a specimen. The cedar case was a cabinet of patience, built by hands that had believed one future person might be exact enough to find the turn of a hidden disk. She went to the workbench and found the small candle among the packages, though she had overlooked it the night before. It was wrapped in waxed paper and tied with linen thread. The wick had darkened with age, and the beeswax had bloomed pale at the surface, giving off a faint scent of honey, dust, and cedar. A label lay beneath it in the same hand as the letter. Made from old comb, 1929. For the next opening. 60 years, perhaps more, had passed since anyone had made that candle with a purpose. It had crossed decades in darkness while roofs failed, boards softened, maps lost authority, school children grew old, and names were forgotten in county files. It had waited beside needles, borax, cloth, and money that was not meant to glitter. Luna set it in the tin cup and placed the cup on the table. She struck one of Emmett's matches. The flame rose, bent in the draft, then took the wick. For a moment, the candle did not know whether it would burn. Then the beeswax warmed, and a small steady light gathered itself in the room. It was not enough to fill the cabin. That was not its work. It made a circle no wider than 2 hands, touching the letter, the bone folder, the clerk's pencil, the edge of the map, and Luna's fingers resting on the table. The rest of the room remained in shadow, but the shadow no longer seemed to own everything. She sat with the candle until the first softened wax ran down one side. As the flame worked, names came to her, not from the letter only, but from the weeks before the cabin opened. The bus driver who had let her down without making shame of the fare. The woman in the red knit hat who had pointed her toward a basement breakfast. The seafood counter owner who had set chowder on stainless steel and looked away so she could eat with dignity. Mrs. Bellingham with her pencil, her map, and the 4 bills under the otter paperweight. Emmett Haskell writing an account in a ledger for a girl whose address was a condemned room. None of those kindnesses had declared itself important when it happened. A ride to the paid stop. A direction. A bowl. A pencil. A line of credit. Small things. Almost forgettable things, if a person measured life only by rescue. But no single bridge carries all the weight of crossing. Sometimes a person arrives because many hands, each for a moment, refuse to let the water have her. And you, listening now, may have such a kindness stored somewhere in you. Perhaps it was a meal handed over without a question, or a stranger who waited while you found your keys, or a teacher who wrote one honest sentence in the margin of work everyone else ignored. Perhaps it was so small that you have never told anyone, yet you still remember the weather, the doorway, the cup, the sound of that person's voice. If you carry one of those moments, write it down in the comments. Not to make it grand, to keep it from being lost. Some stories survive because ordinary people admit they were once held up by ordinary mercy. The candle shortened by the width of a fingernail. Luna did not make plans that day beyond what the day could hold. She ate oatmeal thin with water and salt. She carried ash outside. She wrapped the metal again in wool and placed it beside the letter. She returned the bank envelopes to the tin box, not hidden behind the panel now, but set in the back drawer of the workbench beneath a folded cloth. She placed the tools on a clean strip of paper, touching each one once as if greeting a roomful of elders whose names she had not yet learned. Near evening, rain began again, steady and fine. She read the technical instructions a third time, not the whole letter now, only the parts with temperatures, ratios, timings, and warnings against haste. The measurements comforted her. They did not require her to feel anything correctly. They required her to change blotters, mind heat, label packets, tell the truth with her hands. That she could do, or begin to do. Before sleeping, she moved the shoebox from the front wall to the workroom, near the cedar case. She set the letter, the metal, the herb map, the small plant press boards, and the wrap tools beside it, forming a low square of kept things within reach of her hand. The candle she pinched out with wetted fingers and saved, leaving most of its length for other openings. The room darkened at once, but the scent of beeswax remained. She lay on the floor with her coat pulled over her shoulders and the heirlooms beside her, close enough that if she woke in the night afraid the day had invented them, she could stretch one hand into the dark and find paper, wool, cedar, metal, and truth. The first snow came on December 4, not as a storm, but as a correction. By morning, 2 inches lay along the fallen rails, on the shoulders of the walnuts, and in a white seam across the cabin threshold where the door did not meet its frame. Snow made the clearing appear newly drawn, every broken thing outlined with patient accuracy. The roof showed its injuries more plainly under that pale weight. A soft dip above the back room, a dark wetness near the chimney, 3 missing cedar shakes over the north eave. One place where the sheathing beneath had begun to sag between rafters, making a shallow bowl that held snowmelt until it found the ceiling. Luna did not climb that morning. She read. The repair booklet lay open on the table, its pages weighted by the bone folder and the enamel mug. Chapter 3 was titled Temporary Roof Stabilization and Shake Replacement. She read it once while oatmeal thickened on the stove, once while the stove cooled, and once more in the afternoon with the clerk's pencil in hand. The drawings were blunt and practical. Rafter tail, sister rafter. Chalk line, drip edge, felt lap, fastener spacing. Do not roof over rot. Do not trust moss. She copied measurements into her notebook after pacing the cabin from inside and out. 22 feet along the front wall, 30 feet along the side. Roof pitch near 8 and 12. Steeper than she liked, though the booklet said steep roofs shed weather if kept whole. The damaged plane above the back room measured roughly 10 feet by 12, with a smaller compromise strip near the chimney. She calculated too much, then too little, then again. 1 square of roofing covered 100 square feet, but cedar shakes came bundled by exposure and width, and patchwork did not honor clean arithmetic. At Haskell Hardware, Emmett listened without interrupting while she read from her list. 15-pound felt, 36 inches wide, 22 feet. Galvanized roofing nails, 1 3/4 inch, ring shank if used. Cedar shakes, 24 inch, enough for 140 square feet with waste. Flashing patch by the chimney. Chalk line, roof brackets if there are used ones. He leaned both hands on the counter. You going up there alone? No, sir. That was true because she had decided, while walking into town through slush, that truth mattered more than pride. I need to know who can look at it before I put weight on it. Emmett opened the ledger, found her page, and added slowly. Cedar shakes. Seconds bundle, $38. Roofing felt cut from open roll, $6.50. Galvanized ring shank nails, 5 pounds, $9.75. Tin flashing scrap, $4. Chalk line, used, $2.25. 2 roof brackets, borrowed. 1 nail apron with a split pocket, no charge if returned. Tarred rope, borrowed. Then he reached beneath the counter and brought out a hatchet wrapped in burlap. The head was narrow and dark, with a notch at the back for pulling nails. The handle had been replaced long ago and worn smooth where a thumb would rest. He set it down between them, not lightly. My aunt used that for roofing before she took sick, he said. Her hands were stronger than mine. Bring it back sharp or bring it back honest. Luna touched the handle with 2 fingers. I will. You need a man named Orrin Pike, Emmett continued. Former roofer. Former many things. Lives past the school bus yard with a blue mailbox shaped like a fish. He will say no first. Let him. Orrin Pike said no before the door was fully open. He was 82, narrow as a fence post, with a white beard trimmed square beneath his chin and eyes the color of weathered tin. He wore suspenders over a thermal shirt, wool socks inside rubber sandals, and a hearing aid that whistled whenever he turned his head too fast. His porch held stacked firewood, 1 metal chair, and 6 coffee cans filled with nails sorted by kind. No, he said. Luna stood in the path with snowmelt dripping from her coat. Yes, sir. I said no. Yes, sir. What did Emmett tell you? To let you say it first. The old man looked past her toward the road, then at the hatchet handle visible from her satchel. His face changed by a fraction. That Elsie Haskell's hatchet. Yes, sir. You know how to swing it. No, sir. Good. Fewer bad habits. He would not take money because she had none and because, he said, money made young people talk too much while learning. He would accept coffee if she ever had it, and silence always. The next morning he arrived at the cabin in a faded pickup that sounded near death and kept running anyway. In the bed were planks, 2 ladders, a coil of rope, a chalk box, and a thermos dented on one side. He did not admire the cabin. He did not condemn it. He walked around it twice, touched the corner posts, pressed his knife into 3 rafter tails, and stood back with his chin lifted toward the sag. Could be worse. That was the only blessing he gave. The roof took 11 days. They worked in short winter light, beginning after frost loosened and stopping before the roof turned slick in evening damp. Orrin moved slowly on the ladder but changed once he was braced above the eave. His body remembered angles his age had otherwise hidden. He taught in fragments. 3 points always. She shifted her knee. Not there. She moved it. He showed her how to lay a sister rafter beside the softened one from inside the back room, jacking the sag no more than a 1/4 inch at a time with a post and wedge so the roof would not crack in protest. The new rafter was not new, but a straight salvaged fir board from his shed, 2x6, cut to match the existing span, buttered with construction adhesive Emmett had written into the account, then fastened with 16-penny galvanized nails staggered every 12 inches. "Do not make a ladder of your nails," Orrin said. He set the first one. 3 strokes. 1 to place, 1 to drive, 1 to seat. Not a showy swing. Exact. The nail head met wood flush, neither sunken nor raised. "That nail's proud," he said when Luna's first attempt stood high. "Pull it." She pulled it. By the 4th day, she could set a line. Orrin snapped blue chalk across the roof plane, the string humming against cold air before striking the felt. Felt ran from low edge upward, each course overlapping by at least 4 inches. The booklet opened below and Orrin's voice above correcting what the drawings could not. She learned that water did not need much invitation. It found every arrogant seam. She learned to keep cut edges clean, nails high enough to be covered by the next course, and valleys free of scraps. The cedar shakes had to be sorted before use. 2 split. 2 warped. Sound enough. Narrow filler. Wide course. Orrin made her stack them by hand on a tarp, saying a roof failed first in the choices made on the ground. Snow came again on the 7th day. Only 1/2 inch, but enough to stop work and send them under the porch eave while the stove warmed the front room behind them. He drank hot water because she had no coffee. "Roofing is manners," he said. She waited. "Water wants down." "Let it." Then he closed his eyes for 8 minutes and woke before she could decide whether he needed help. The chimney flashing took 2 full afternoons. The tin scrap was cut with snips, bent against a board, slid under the upper shakes, and lapped over the lower course so water would be guided away from brick. Orrin made her redo the first bend because it gapped at one corner. Close is not closed. She redid it. On the 11th day, the patch held through a hard rain that began before dawn and continued past noon. Luna stood inside the back room beneath the place where a steady drip had marked the floor since her first night. A pail waited below it. Nothing fell. The pail remained empty except for dust. Orrin stood beside her, hat in hand, listening as if the roof were speaking a language he had not heard in years. "Mid-December," he said. "Good enough to start winter." He left before she could thank him properly. carrying his ladders but not Elsie Haskell's hatchet, that he hung on a nail beside the door. "Keep it through spring," he said. "You will find more rot." By January, the chimney had begun to shed itself into the room. At first it was only powder on the stone hearth, fine and sandy, the color of weak tea. Then a thumbnail-sized piece of mortar dropped behind the stovepipe and struck the wall with a sound sharp enough to wake her before dawn. Outside, freezing rain glazed the north side of the cabin, and the chimney stood in that ice with its missing crown exposed, brick faces flaking where water had entered and expanded night after night. Spalling. Emmett named it at the counter when she brought him a broken piece wrapped in newspaper. He turned the brick in his palm, rubbed the face with his thumb, and watched red grit fall. Water got in. Freeze opened it. Mortar is powdered. You keep firing hard. You lose draft. Maybe worse. I have to keep firing. You have to keep firing small. He sold her no Portland cement. That, he said, would be too hard for old brick and would trap what needed to breathe. Instead, he wrote out a mix on brown paper, 2 parts washed sharp sand, 1 part hydraulic lime, 1/2 part fire clay for the joints nearest heat, water added slowly until it held a ridge on the trowel. For outer crown patching, less fire clay, more lime. Mist old brick before setting mortar. Keep from freezing 72 hours if possible, which in January meant foolishness, blankets, and prayer. "I do not sell prayer," he said. "Reverend Boyd handles that." He did sell her a tuck pointer for 4.10, a margin trowel with a cracked handle for 2.80 cents, a wire brush for 1.35 cents, a canvas drop cloth from the used bin for $3, and a small sack of hydraulic lime written carefully into the ledger. The fire clay came from a torn bag in the back, weighed into a coffee tin and marked scrap. He added 2 burlap sacks and told her to soak them in warm water and hang them near the work so drying would not happen too fast. You rush mortar, it remembers. For 3 weeks, the chimney governed every day. Temperatures stayed in the 20s most mornings, rising only to 32 or 33 by noon, then dropping before light left the trees. Luna learned to work in intervals measured by feeling in her fingers. 15 minutes with bare hands, because gloves could not judge a joint cleanly. Then hands under her arms. Then breath blown into cup palms. Then back to the brick. Inside, she dismantled the stovepipe sections one by one and labeled their order with chalk. She stuffed the thimble opening with a rag so soot would not fall into the room, then cleared the hearth and spread the canvas drop cloth. The lower chimney joints had receded until some bricks could be rocked with 2 fingers. She removed only what failed. That was Orrin's advice when he came by once, stood in the doorway, and declined to enter. "Do not improve what holds." "Yes, sir. People wreck houses improving them." He left a wooden mortar hawk on the porch. She brushed each joint until loose sand stopped falling. She raked the failed mortar back 3/4 of an inch, deeper where it had turned to powder. She misted the brick with water warmed on the stove, watching it darken and drink. The first batch of mortar she made too wet, and it slumped from the trowel with the discouraging softness of porridge. She scraped it back into the pan, added sand and lime by the ratios, and tried again until it held its shape when she cut a line through it. The tuck pointer was narrow enough to press mortar deep without smearing the brick face. She packed from the back of the joint outward, layer by layer, then struck the surface slightly concave with the rounded end of a broken spoon. Emmett had told her old chimneys liked a joint that shed water but did not pretend to be factory work. She wiped only what needed wiping. Too much wiping brought lime to the surface and left pale scars. The top courses were harder. She would not climb the roof in frost, So the chimney crown waited for 3 clear afternoons when sun appeared weakly and vanished early. Orrin returned with his ladder and stood below, holding the rope, while she worked from a roof bracket. Body angled, boots set carefully. 2 bricks at the crown had cracked through. One lifted free in her hand. She cleaned the bed, set it back in fresh mortar, pressed until the joint squeezed evenly along both sides. Too much, Orrin called. She lifted, scraped away a portion, reset. The crown patch was not pretty. It sloped, as required, away from the flue. It shed water. That was its dignity. Each evening, she wrapped the new mortar with damp burlap, then covered the inside hearth joints with a warmed board propped near the stove, careful not to dry them fast. The cabin smelled of lime, wet brick, ash, and wool. Her hands cracked at the knuckles. Fine white dust entered the lines of her skin and remained no matter how often she washed. The work left no room for large thoughts. There was only rake, brush, mist, mix, pack, strike, cover. Again. On the coldest morning, the jar of water near the door had a skin of ice thick enough to lift. She sat on the floor beside the hearth with her hands numb to the wrists, unable for several minutes to close her fingers around the trowel. The room held the colorless light of late January. Her breath clouded in front of her. Ash lay ready. Mortar waited under damp cloth. She could have stopped. Instead, she rested her hands against the warmest stone at the edge of the hearth, not to force them awake, only to invite blood back slowly. When feeling returned, it came as pain, bright and needled. She accepted it with her jaw set and packed 3 more joints before noon. The test fire came on January 29. She had let the final inner repair cure as long as weather allowed, then longer because Emmett's voice had taken up residence in the room. She reassembled the pipe, checking seams, screws, and angle. She opened the stove damper. Outside, the chimney rose blunt and patched against a low sky. Inside, the hearth sat clean, its joints uneven but firm. First she burned paper. Smoke lifted. Then cedar twigs. Smoke lifted faster. Then a piece of split alder no thicker than her wrist. Flame took the dry edge and settled into a steady burn. She went outside and stood in the clearing. Looking up, a thin column of smoke left the chimney cleanly, not rolling, not leaking through side cracks, not staining the brick with panic. It rose into the cold air and disappeared among the dark firs. When she came back in, the room had begun to warm. The heat was modest, almost shy, but it held. The floors could wait no longer because every repair crossed them. White pine planks ran through the front room beneath old varnish, soot, dirt, and the scars of furniture long removed. At first Luna had thought them cedar like the walls, but after weeks of sweeping, scraping, and crawling, the grain revealed itself differently, pale beneath damage. Straightened some boards, wild near knots, soft enough to hold every chair leg, boot heel, drop tool, and winter of neglect. Hand-cut rosehead nails fixed the planks to joists, each nail head irregular, some black with age, some raised just enough to catch cloth. Emmett rented her a random orbit sander for $14 a day and made her sign twice, once for the tool and once for the warning. You hit a nail, you buy the pad. I will set them. You miss one. I will try not to. You will miss one. Everyone misses one. He sold her a nail set for $60, sanding discs in 3 grits, and a paper mask that pinched the bridge of her nose. He advised 80 grit first, then 120, then 220 if the wood had anything left to offer. Vacuum between passes if she had power, which she did not. Sweep. Wipe with a barely damp cloth. Wait. Then sand again. He found a quart of tung oil on a back shelf, dented but sealed, and a smaller can of boiled linseed oil. 3 coats, thin. 48 hours of cure between if the weather stayed damp. Rags laid flat outside or burned safe. Never bunched. Oily rags make their own fire, he said. Houses hate that. Before sanding, she spent 2 full days setting nails. The rosehead nails were too beautiful to hide and too dangerous to leave proud. She worked along each plank with the nail set and a small hammer, tapping only until the head sat a fraction below the surface. Some nails refused. Some bent. Some had to be pulled and replaced with cut nails from a jar found in the workbench drawer. She marked loose boards with chalk, lifted too near the door, cleaned rot from beneath, and sistered short blocking between joists using scrap fir and 8-penny nails. The sander changed the room by sound first. It roared where every previous tool had spoken in taps, scrapes, and breaths. The vibration climbed her arms to the shoulders. Dust rose in pale clouds and settled in her hair, on the shelves. Across the stove, over the letter folded safely inside its envelope in the workroom drawer. She worked with windows cracked despite the cold, moving in steady overlapping paths, never lingering long enough to hollow the soft pine. 80 grit removed the gray and black skin of the floor. It showed damage honestly. Water stains near the door. A burn mark by the stove. 3 dark crescents where something metal had rested for years. The patch where a rug had been was lighter, almost tender. She did not try to erase every mark. A floor with no memory would have been a lie. 120 grit softened the first pass. The boards began to take light differently, no longer dull beneath dust, but faintly reflective along drain lines. She swept for nearly an hour, pushing dust into careful piles, then wiped with a cloth wrung hard and waited while the surface dried. 220 was slower and quieter, less removal than invitation. Her hands learned where the sander wanted to pull and where the pine wanted to burnish. By the end of the rental day, she could barely lift her arms. She carried the sander back at dusk, wrapped in canvas against the rain. Emmett inspected the pad, found one small nick, and looked at her over the counter. "Yes, sir." He grunted and did not charge her. The first coat was tung oil cut lightly with linseed, brushed thin and rubbed by hand with a cotton rag until the wood drank without pooling. The color changed under her fingers. Dark honey in the front room. Deeper amber near the stove. Mahogany where old smoke and pine resin had entered the grain for decades. She worked from the back corner toward the door, kneeling, rubbing, backing out slowly so she would not step where the oil shone wet. The smell filled the cabin, nutty, warm, and faintly sharp. After the first coat, the floor looked hungry. After the second, it looked remembered. After the third, when 48 hours had passed between each careful layer and rain had come and gone twice, the boards held a low sheen that did not pretend to be new. The rosehead nail sat like dark seeds in rows. The burn mark by the stove remained. The water stain near the door remained. The path between table and workroom showed under the finish as a soft ribbon, made by feet no longer present. One morning during the curing days, she woke and could not begin. No single event caused it. The stove had burned low. Her shoulder ached where the sander had pulled. Her heel had healed only to be replaced by a deep tiredness in the arches of both feet. The roof still wanted further work. The chimney was patched but not handsome. The windows rattled in every wind. The account at the hardware store had become a line of numbers she could not yet answer. Even the letter, with all its welcome, could not lift a body that had become heavy with effort. So she did not work. She took the herb map, not to gather, only to walk. Beyond the second walnut, a deer trail led toward a marshy opening where cattails stood brown and split. Their fluff caught on blackberry thorns. Water lay under a thin skin of ice near the edges, open in the center where sedge moved with the current. She sat on a fallen log and watched a great blue heron stand in the shallows. The bird did almost nothing. It placed one foot, waited, placed the other, waited longer. Its neck folded and unfolded with the grave economy of a tool used correctly. Rain gathered on its back and did not disturb it. Once, it struck the water and lifted a small silver fish, swallowed, then became still again. Luna sat there until her hands grew cold inside her sleeves and the day leaned toward afternoon. She did not name her exhaustion. She did not defeat it. She gave it one day beside water and a bird that understood stillness as labor. The cabin had been waiting, and so had she. At dusk, she returned to the front room and did nothing more than lay one flat palm against the cured floor. It was cool, smooth, and real beneath her hand. February entered through the windows because the windows had never agreed to keep it out. There were 8 in all, 2 across the front, 1 beside the stove, 1 small high window in the workroom, 2 along the south wall, 1 near the back door, and 1 narrow sash above the workbench that had somehow remained more elegant than the building around it. 3 had no glass at all. Only plastic Luna had tacked across them with roofing caps. 4 were cracked, with old breaks running from corner to corner like lightning remembered in silica. 1, the narrow sash over the workbench, held wavy glass so full of bubbles and faint distortion that the outside world bent gently when seen through it. Orne looked at that one and said, "Do not replace it." "I was not going to." Emmett told her the glass was likely very early salvage, possibly older than the cabin itself, perhaps carried from a demolished farmhouse or schoolhouse and set into the station by someone who could not discard a useful pane. He did not certify the date. He only said its waviness belonged to another century and to leave it in peace. She made a window list on the back of a flattened oatmeal tube. Front left. Missing, 22 by 28. Front right. Cracked. Replace lower pane. Stove wall. Cracked but stable. Glaze only. South 1. Missing, 20 by 24. South 2. Crack through center. Replace. Back door. Missing, small. Workroom high. Cracked. Replace. Workbench narrow. Original. Preserve. The materials came in modest parcels. Salvage panes cut to size from Emmett's back room. DAP 33 glazing putty in a white tub. Glazier's points in a paper packet. A putty knife with one corner rounded by use. Boiled linseed oil for priming dry rabbits. And 1/4-inch cotton sash cord. The cord pleased her more than it should have. It was braided, firm, and honest in the hand. "Synthetic lasts," Emmett said. "Cotton belongs." So cotton went into the ledger. The first task was not glass. It was removal. She worked each sash free from paint, dirt, and the slow swelling of wet seasons. Some lifted after patient persuasion. Some required the pry bar wrapped in cloth. One came loose all at once and nearly struck her knee. The missing windows had frames furred with moss inside the lower channels. She scraped them clean with the awl and a stiff brush, then wiped the rabbets with linseed oil so the dry wood would not steal oil from the putty too fast. DAP 33 had the texture of stiff dough when cold. She kept the tub near the stove until it softened enough to roll between her palms. Emmett had shown her the motion on a scrap frame at the counter. Thumb pressure, steady angle, no fussing after the bevel was struck. Bed the pane in a thin rope of putty. Press glass gently until it seated. Set glazier's points with the putty knife. 2 per side on modest panes, more if the frame was restless. Then lay the outer bevel. Knife at 45 degrees. Clean pull from corner to corner. Corners tell on you, he said. Her first corner told badly. She scraped it out and tried again. By the third window, her hand began to understand that putty preferred confidence without haste. Too timid, and it dragged. Too forceful, and it thinned. A good bevel shed rain not because it was pretty, but because it gave water no shelf on which to linger. She learned to warm small amounts in her palm. Press, draw, clean the knife, draw again. The smell of linseed and putty settled into the room, joining cedar, ash, lime, and the faint sweetness of old beeswax. The sash cords took longer than expected. 2 of the windows had counterweights hidden behind trim panels. The ropes had rotted into soft brown threads that snapped when she touched them. She removed the stop beads carefully, labeling each with pencil on the back. Inside the pocket, the iron weights hung like plum truths in darkness. She tied the new 1/4-inch cotton sash cord through the weight eye with a figure-8 knot, dressed it tight, then ran the cord over the pulley, and attached it to the sash groove with small nails, leaving enough travel for the window to rise without dropping the weight into the pocket. The first knot slipped under load. She sat on the floor, untied it, retied it, and tested again with both hands ready. The weight held. The sash rose 6 inches and stayed. That was enough victory for one afternoon. February rain came sideways twice, testing her work before she was ready to trust it. The front left pane held. The south missing pane held. The back door window rattled until she added a thin wedge and a second point along the lower edge. One cracked window she did not replace because the break had not opened and the glass remained seated. She cleaned it, reglazed it, and let the crack remain visible, a fine pale line crossing the view of salmonberry canes and wet fern. The original narrow sash over the workbench received only cleaning and respect. She removed no glass. She brushed loose putty from the outside, pressed fresh compound only where gaps had opened, and worked around the bubbled pane as if tending skin. When the morning light passed through it afterward, the workbench looked under water, softened by a century of imperfect making. The last window was the high one in the workroom. She had saved it because reaching it required standing on the stool, braced against the bench, and because the frame seemed most likely to splinter. A crack ran from the upper left corner to the center, where it branched in 3 directions. Cold entered there with a narrow whistle. She removed the points one by one, catching the broken glass in gloved hands, then cleaned the frame with a small brush until cedar dust fell into her sleeve. Outside, on the walnut branch visible through the empty opening, a chickadee landed. It was near enough that she could see the black cap, the white cheek, the tiny claws closing around wet bark. The bird turned its head and looked into the cabin with the bold impatience of small creatures. For several breaths, neither moved. The workroom held its tools, its cedar case, its map, its newly oiled floor, and the open frame between inside and winter. The chickadee flicked its tail once. Then it flew. Luna set the new paint into its bed of putty and pressed until the edges kissed the frame all around. 2 points on the left, 2 on the right, 1 top, 1 bottom, bevel drawn clean, corner joined. Excess scraped back into the tub. She climbed down and looked through the glass. The branch outside was empty now, but the room was warmer for having held the visit. By late February, the walls began asking for attention in a language of dust. The original plaster had survived more faithfully than the roof, which surprised her until Orrin stood in the front room and rapped 1 knuckle along the wall. Behind the pale surface was hand-split oak lath, narrow strips fastened with cut nails, each one uneven in width and stubborn in purpose. Brown horsehair showed where 3 patches had failed near the chimney, curling from the broken plaster like fine dark thread. The wall had not been made quickly. Nothing about it had been made quickly. Water and chimney heat had opened the worst places. 1 patch above the hearth had loosened into a hollow belly. Another near the stovepipe had cracked from corner to corner. The third, along the side wall where winter damp had found a seam, had failed down to lath in a ragged oval the size of a serving platter. Emmett came out one afternoon with a paper sack under his arm and stood close to the chimney wall without touching it. "Horsehair," he said. "Hard to find now unless you know barns with memory." From the sack he removed a tied bundle wrapped in yellowed newspaper. The hair had been saved from a 1950s plaster job, he said, when his father still mixed by eye and cursed modern shortcuts under his breath. It smelled faintly of dust, lime, and hayloft. He sold it for nothing and wrote nothing in the ledger, which was his way of saying the material belonged to the wall more than to commerce. The mix was written on the back of a receipt. Lime putty, sharp sand, chopped horsehair, and enough water to make a plaster that held to the hawk without slumping. For the scratch coat, rougher sand and more hair. For the brown coat, a tighter mix, built to 3/8 of an inch and left 72 hours. For the finish coat, fine sand, less hair, 1/8 inch, worked only until smooth, not polished dead. She began by cutting back the failed edges with a utility knife and a stiff putty blade, removing every loose piece until the remaining plaster rang firm under her knuckle. The exposed lath was dry near the top and damp near the bottom, so she waited a day with the stove low and the window cracked. Waiting had become part of the work. Not delay. Work. When the lath was ready, she brushed it clean, misted it, and pressed the scratch coat through the gaps until it formed keys behind the strips. The plaster resisted the first attempts, dropping to the floor in wet slaps. She gathered it, adjusted the mix, and tried again. The horsehair gave the lime body. The wall accepted it. She scored the surface with horizontal lines so the next coat would have a place to grip. The brown coat went on 3 days later, built in patient passes. 3/8 of an inch sounded slight until held upright on a vertical wall with winter damp in the room. She used a straight edge made from scrap cedar to keep the patch level with the surrounding plaster. Too proud, and the repair would announce itself. Too shallow, and it would hold shadow. She worked until her shoulders ached from the upward pressure of trowel and hawk. These patches will hold another 100 years. The sentence came plainly, not as certainty, but as a standard. It made her slow down. The finish coat was the gentlest and the least forgiving. 1/8 inch. Fine sand. Lime pressed thin and feathered at the edges. She kept the trowel clean, wiped its blade after every pass, and stopped before the surface became fussy. The repaired places dried lighter, then settled toward the wall's color as days passed. They remained visible if a person knew how to look, but not ashamed. The cabin had scars now that had been tended instead of hidden. Doris Bell owned the Rainfern Cafe, though everyone in town still called it Bell's because her parents had painted that name on the window in 1974, and Doris saw no reason to pay for new lettering. She was a woman of compact build with silver hair cut to her chin, a flour-dusted apron, and wrists strong from lifting coffee urns, soup pots, and full trays through decades of wet mornings. She did not ask people whether they were hungry. She watched the way they looked at menus. The first paper bag appeared on the cabin porch during the plaster cure. Luna found it at dawn, folded twice at the top and weighted by a smooth creek stone. Inside were 2 biscuits wrapped in wax paper, a jar of bean soup, 3 apples with bruises carefully cut away, and a heel of brown bread. No note. The second bag came 4 days later. Oatmeal, onions, a wedge of cheddar wrapped in butcher paper, and a small tin of tea leaves that smelled of orange peel. On the third delivery, Luna caught Doris crossing the clearing in rubber boots, carrying another bag in the crook of her arm as if she were only moving something from one shelf to another. "I cannot pay for all this," Luna said. Doris set the bag on the porch and straightened slowly. "Didn't ask. I need to."
In candles when the shop reopens.
The sentence was neither bargain nor charity. It was a future spoken as if it had already found a chair at the table. Doris looked past Luna at the repaired window, the smoke leaving the chimney cleanly, the door wedged square in its frame. "My mother remembered the school cases," she said. "A fox and 3 birds. She said they made the room feel like the woods had sent ambassadors." Then Doris turned and walked back through the wet fern before gratitude could become too large and inconvenient. Caleb Haskell arrived on a Saturday afternoon riding a red Schwinn bicycle with 1 mismatched pedal and a milk crate wired over the back wheel. He was 16, narrow-shouldered, freckled across the nose, and still growing into his hands. A splitting maul balanced across the handlebars, the head wrapped in cloth to keep it from striking the frame. His hair stuck out from beneath a knit cap, and his jacket sleeves were too short by half an inch. "My grandfather said you have wood wrong," he announced. Luna looked from him to the small stack near the shed, where she had split only what necessity demanded. "Wrong how?" "Too long. Wet side in. No air." He leaned the bicycle against a walnut trunk and set the maul upright. He did not wait for permission because teenage boys often mistake usefulness for permission, and in this case he was close enough. He rest-stacked the pile on 2 old rails to lift it from the ground. Bark side up, cut ends open to air. He split the larger rounds with a rhythm not polished but determined. When the maul glanced once and buried itself in mud, his ears reddened, but he said nothing. She brought him water in the enamel mug. He drank, wiped his mouth with his sleeve, and refused the coin she offered from the small jar reserved for necessities. "My mother said." "About your grandfather." That was all. He came again the next week, and the next, always by bicycle unless rain turned the road to running mud. He sharpened the hatchet with a stone he carried in his pocket. He showed her how to stack kindling under the eave by thickness, not merely by size. Once, when a storm had dropped cedar limbs across the access track, he arrived with a bow saw and worked until dusk, leaving the neat cut lengths where she could drag them in stages. He never asked about the cabin's hidden things. He never entered unless invited. His manners were still unfinished, but they leaned toward honor. Reverend Boyd walked past every morning at 7:40, give or take the weather. His church stood closer to town, but he lived beyond the Madsen place in a parsonage with peeling white trim and a vegetable garden fenced against elk. He was tall, spare, and dark-skinned, with a gray beard trimmed close and a brown felt hat that had seen more rain than many roofs. On his walks, he carried no umbrella. Rain gathered on his shoulders and stayed there until it chose otherwise. The first time he passed the cabin track, Luna was hauling broken plaster to a low place behind the shed. He stopped by the fallen rail fence, lifted 2 fingers to the brim of his hat, and said only, "Peace on this house." 4 words. Then he continued. After that, he said the same prayer whenever he passed close enough to be heard. Some mornings Luna was on the roof, tightening a patch. Some mornings she was at the well. Some mornings she heard only his voice through the front window while her hands were inside a wall or a drawer or a basin of lime water. Peace on this house. He did not ask to come in. He did not ask what had brought her there. He did not tell her suffering had a purpose, which was a cruelty often dressed as comfort. He merely tipped his hat to the cabin, to the smoke, to the repaired windows, and to the labor he saw continuing one day at a time. In early March, he left a folded tarp at the gate with a note pinned to it. Borrow as long as rain exists. Luna read the line twice because it sounded like theology and weather at once. She postponed the cellar until February 11 because underground rooms require a certain kind of courage. There was a trapdoor beneath the workroom rug, though rug was a generous name for the stiff, mouse-chewed square of woven fiber that had been hiding the pull ring since before she arrived. She had found the ring while oiling the floor, traced its outline, and then placed the rug back over it for another day. Roof first. Chimney. Floor. Windows. Walls. Each task had been a rung on a ladder leading downward. On February 11, after breakfast and before weather could change her mind, she cleared the workroom, lit the stove, tied a cloth over her mouth, and lifted the ring. The trapdoor opened with a long sigh of hinges and a smell of cold stone. 7 granite steps descended into darkness. They were narrow, damp at the edges, and worn shallow in the center by feet that had used them long before county files forgot the place. Luna set a lantern at the top, then another on the 3rd step, both lit low to save oil. She tested each step before committing weight. The air below smelled of fieldstone, earth, iron, and roots. The cellar measured 12 feet by 15, larger than she expected, with a fieldstone floor fitted by hand and walls laid without vanity. Moisture darkened the lower stones. Fern roots had entered at one corner in thin pale threads. Along the west wall stood 3 shelves, empty except for broken jars and one stoneware crock with a cracked lid. Hooks lined a ceiling beam. A rusted coal shovel leaned near a drain cut into the floor. At the center of the cellar lay a single dressed granite slab. It did not match the fieldstone around it. It was rectangular, smooth on top, set flush with the surrounding floor, and marked near one corner with a carved symbol, a fern frond crossing a small curved blade, the mark of the Wren work, though Luna knew it only by recognition of shape rather than instruction. The slab seemed placed, not accidental, not lost. Waiting. She knelt beside it and brushed grit from the carving. Her fingers found no ring, no seam wide enough for a pry bar, no sign that it wished to be moved by a person guessing. So she did not lift it. Some doors were not opened because curiosity had grown strong. Some waited for the right question, and she did not yet know it. She cleaned the cellar enough to understand it. Broken glass into a bucket, sound jars to the shelf, leaves swept from the drain. A careful chalk mark near the loose stone in the east wall. Her breath made pale clouds in the lantern light. On the stairs going up, her boot struck something beneath the 3rd step. The sound was small but wooden, different from stone. She crouched, lifted the lantern, and saw a dark line under the stair tread where a wedge of oak had been tucked behind a splintered support. It took the all in 10 minutes of patient work to free it without damage. The object slid out into her palm, a small oak box, no longer than her hand, blackened by age but dry. Inside lay a brass key and a tin-type photograph. The key was heavy for its size. Its bow had been shaped like the same craft mark carved in the granite slab, fern-crossing blade, though softened by use along the edges. The bit was narrow and unusual, cut with 2 deep steps and a shallow tooth. No label named its lock. The photograph had darkened at the corners. A young woman stood before the cabin in summer light, one hand resting on the cedar doorframe, the other holding a small plant press against her hip. Her waist was narrow, her skirt plain, her hair pinned high. Yet her face, in the severe stillness required by the camera, carried a resemblance so direct that Luna sat down on the cellar step. Not identical, more unsettling than identical. The same guarded mouth, the same eyes made cautious by attention, the same way of standing as if stillness had been learned rather than chosen. On the back, in brown ink, someone had written, Miriam Alder, daughter of Thomas Alder, age 25, summer of 1903. The date was impossible by ordinary arithmetic if read too quickly, and then possible when she remembered that photographs could be copied. Mislabeled, inherited, retouched, carried forward. Maybe the back had been written years later. Maybe the age was a family error. Maybe Miriam had kept an older image of a mother, aunt, or namesake, and the note had blurred generations into one cherished face. The exact truth would wait. The resemblance did not. Luna carried the photograph upstairs as if carrying flame. She set it on the mantel between the candle and the folded letter. The brass key she placed beside it, then moved it twice, finally leaving it where morning light from the front window would touch the shaped bow. She did not know what it opened. For once, not knowing did not feel like hunger. By March, the snow retreated from the clearing in torn pieces. It lingered where the cabin shadow held the ground, then thinned, then disappeared into black soil and last year's leaves. The creek grew loud with snowmelt, pushing brown foam around stones and carrying cedar needles in quick circles before releasing them downstream. Walnut catkins appeared like tassels, first tight and green, then lengthening in the damp air. Skunk cabbage opened in the low places with yellow hoods bright enough to seem lit from within. The house took spring slowly. Damp left the corners by degrees. The patch plaster settled in color. The roof no longer answered rain with panic. The windows, imperfect but seated, held back enough weather for the stove to rest some mornings. Birds came nearer. Chickadees first, then wrens, then a varied thrush whose orange breast moved through salal like a coal carried carefully under leaves. Luna opened the herb map on clear afternoons and walked its first marks without harvesting. Devil's Club stood armored in green near the wet draw. Oregon grape showed glossy leaves under fir shade. Licorice fern rooted along maple limbs, its rhizomes hidden in moss. She wrote dates, weather, and locations in a notebook, but her knife stayed closed. She had decided not to begin the craft that spring. The decision surprised her by feeling like obedience rather than failure. The letter had not asked for performance. It had asked for care. She would order proper blotting paper with 1 coin when she could justify the expense, and practice first on fallen leaves, roadside weeds, and scraps of linen. She would learn wheat starch paste in small batches before mounting anything rare. She would study bird anatomy from books before touching any body death had left behind. Tools were not permission. Money was not mastery. A name was not an apprenticeship completed. One silver coin did leave the tin that April, recorded in the notebook with date, reason, and remaining count. She used it for blotter sheets, archival paper, 2 new scalpel blades, and a thermometer that could hang near the stove without lying. The rest stayed wrapped, sealed, and untempted, provision rather than escape. On the last evening of April, she sat on the porch plank Orrin had helped replace, watching rain travel across the clearing in visible bands. The brass key rested on the mantel inside. The photograph watched the room. Doris's latest paper bag held potatoes and 1 candle stub for melting down. Caleb's woodpile stood high enough for confidence. Reverend Boyd's borrowed tarp hung folded near the door, ready because rain still existed. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, the first finished piece stood beneath the workroom window. It was not large. That mattered to her. A grand beginning would have been a false one. She had chosen a winter fern after 3 seasons of practicing on ordinary things: blackberry leaves, alder catkins, nettle from the roadside ditch, moss already loosened from fallen bark, feathers found beneath the window after a storm, never taken by haste. The fern had been pressed between clean blotters changed at proper intervals, dried near steady warmth, then mounted on archival paper with wheat starch paste cooked until translucent and cooled in a covered jar. The label was written in India ink with a fine nib. Western sword fern, north bank above Bogachiel drainage, found after first hard frost. Rain previous night. Clay loam under hemlock. No root taken. Beside the mounted fern, in a shallow case she had built from salvaged cedar and a pane of wavy glass too, flawed for a window, lay a study skin of a varied thrush found beneath the south window after a storm. She had waited a full day before touching it, then measured as instructed bill. Wing cord, tarsus. Tail, weight by postal scale. Place found, weather. Cotton lightly. Body faithful. Wings set and dried in a cabinet she had repaired with cedar shims. The eyes had taken the longest, not because they were technically hardest, but because courtesy cannot be hurried. When the piece was finished, she did not call anyone. She did not photograph it for praise. She set it beneath the window and let morning examine it first. The restored interior had become modest, useful, and spare. The front room held a scrub table, 2 chairs made steady with wedges, a braided rug Doris had found in a church sale, and the iron stove blacked and polished until its worn places shone from use. Shelves along the wall carried field guides, jars, herb packets, folded cloth, and a ledger in which every expense, gift, repair, and harvest was recorded. The floor held its dark honey color, deepening near the stove and along the path she walked most. The cracked window near the south wall still showed its pale line. She had kept it, not for romance, but because not every break required replacement when the piece remained sound. The workroom was cleaner than it had been at any time she could imagine, but not sterile. No honest workroom is. Blotters dried on a rack. Thread hung from pegs. A row of labels waited under a stone. The great owl case remained against the rear wall, its hidden compartment repaired but not locked, because secrets had done their task and could now become storage. The owl's clouded eye had been cleaned but not replaced. Age had a right to leave one mark. The brass key stayed on the mantel for nearly 2 years before it found its door. It happened after a windstorm in early winter, when one of the walnut trees shed a long limb and opened a view of the trunk she had never had from the porch. A strip of bark had loosened near the horseshoe marker, not broken, only lifted enough to show a glint beneath. Luna noticed it while carrying kindling. She set the wood down and crossed the clearing with the hatchet in one hand, though she knew before reaching the tree that cutting was not what was needed. The bark had grown around a brass plate set into the trunk long ago, not nailed on the surface, fitted into a hollow, then slowly held by the living wood. The plate was green at the edges and almost black at the center. A narrow keyhole sat beneath a sliding cover shaped like a leaf. She cleaned the slot with a thorn, brushed moss away with her sleeve, and went back to the cabin for the key. The shaped bow fit her fingers as if the maker had expected cold hands. The key entered reluctantly. She did not force it. A little oil from Emmett's shelf. A pause. Another careful turn. The lock gave with a sound softer than a drawer closing. Inside the tree was a cedar-lined cavity no wider than a bread loaf. It held a folded 48-star flag wrapped in oilcloth, dry enough that the cloth crackled when opened. The flag was small, perhaps made for a coffin corner, a schoolroom, or a mantel after news no household wanted. Its blue field had faded toward smoke. The white stars remained clear in their rows. Beneath it lay a note. The paper was dated October 2, 1918, a war year, written from Port Angeles in a hand more slanted than Miriam's but related by pressure and restraint. For the one who keeps the house after us, Caleb is in France, and Samuel writes that the mud there has more names than we have prayers. I have folded this flag not for victory but for return, though I know the world does not bargain so neatly. If the men do not come home, let the house remember that they had names before they had uniforms. My mother taught me to hide what grief cannot bear to see daily but must not lose. So this goes into the walnut. Trees keep better than trunks, and living wood has mercy. Ruthie Alder. Luna read the note standing beside the tree with the flag held against her coat. A great-great-grandmother, or near enough that the distinction did not matter in the cold. A woman writing while the First War was still swallowing sons, husbands, brothers, and boys with farmhands. A flag hidden not to celebrate, but to keep grief from being misplaced. The tree had taken the brass plate into itself and stood through storms, county neglect, rot, vacancy, and all the years when no one came to ask what had been kept there. She carried the flag inside and unfolded it only once on the table, with clean hands and windows closed. Then she wrapped it again in fresh cotton and placed Ruthie's note with Miriam's letter, not merging them, not making one story out of lives that deserved their own rooms. The military medal from the tin found its day in May. She chose Memorial Day because the calendar asked the living to pause, and because the name on the medal had finally been matched, through library records, cemetery indexes, and a veteran volunteer in Port Angeles who knew how to search without making a spectacle. The grave was at Mount Angeles Memorial Park, where grass moved in clean slopes and flags stood by stones in ordered rows. She took the medal wrapped in wool, not to leave it, but to let it be seen by the name it had once belonged to. She arrived early, before speeches, before the parking lot filled. The morning was clear enough for the mountains to show themselves above the town. She knelt by the marker, set the medal on the grass for the length of one quiet minute, then lifted it again. Some honors are returned by being carried carefully, not surrendered. Only 3 coins left the hidden reserve in those first 2 years. 1 for paper and blades. 1 for chimney brick and a proper flue cap after the winter winds taught her the temporary patch had served its term. 1 for a used copy of a museum conservation manual found through a bookseller in Olympia, its pages annotated by someone named Francis who objected strongly to careless adhesives. A 4th coin she almost spent on a better coat, then did not, because Doris found one in a church closet and insisted it had been waiting for shoulders narrow enough. Every coin removed was written in the ledger. Date. purpose. Amount by face value. Object purchased. Reason the purchase served the house or the work. The bills remained in their envelopes. Moved to a small fireproof box Emmett ordered at cost, and Orrin bolted beneath the workbench with the seriousness of a man securing a bridge. The silver certificate slept wrapped in cloth. The worn half-dime stayed in a tiny paper folder marked sentimental. No value assigned, because Miriam had been right. The rest was sealed for the next one. Luna wrote those words herself on a new envelope and placed it inside the box. Not for her escape. Not for comfort beyond sufficiency. For the next one. The shop did not reopen with a sign on the highway. It began with an index card on the corkboard at Bell's, pinned between a notice for firewood and a handwritten request for piano lessons. Doris wrote the card because, she said, Luna's handwriting was too careful and would scare away people who thought they needed permission to ask. Bogachiel Field Station, pressed plants, small natural history repairs, field labels copied, herbarium pages mounted. No no rush, leave name at counter. That was all. The first request came from a schoolteacher with 6 pressed leaves her students had collected badly but earnestly. Then a widow brought in her husband's field notebook, asking whether the mildew could be slowed. Then a ranger left a note about a window-struck kingfisher too beautiful, he wrote, to vanish into the ditch without record. Luna accepted only the work she could do honestly. She refused what required boasting. She refused what treated death as decoration. She refused speed. By the next autumn, Doris had a list behind the register with 43 names on it. Not customers exactly. People waiting. People willing to wait. A mailing list, Doris called it, though most of the addresses belonged within 30 miles and many messages traveled by paper bag, church bulletin, hardware receipt, or Caleb on the red Schwinn, now taller, with his jeans too short again. The boy returned one wet afternoon carrying a sign across his bicycle like a sail. He was 18 by then, though still not fully convinced of his own height. The Schwinn had new tires and the same mismatched pedal. A canvas roll of carving tools stuck from his backpack. Rain shone on his cap. He leaned the sign against the porch, covered with a flour sack, and stood back as if pretending not to care whether she looked. She lifted the cloth. The board was cedar, hand-planed, with letters carved deep enough to hold shadow. He had copied the old station sign's plain style, but added a second line beneath it. Bogachiel Field Station. Wren and daughter. Naturalist. The word daughters stopped her. There were no daughters in the cabin. Not in any immediate sense. No children running between rooms. No cradle. No future promised by blood. Caleb saw her pause and began speaking too quickly. It is plural because there were women before. Miriam and Ruthie and whoever else. And after, maybe not your daughters, but somebody's. My mother said names can point both ways. He looked at the mud on his boots. I can plane it down if you hate it. She did not hate it. She carried the sign inside and set it on the table beneath the window. The carved letters held cedar scent where the tool had opened fresh grain. The ampersand was awkward, larger than the rest, but earnest. The plural was not claim. It was room. They hung it the next Saturday when rain paused. Caleb held the ladder. Orrin criticized the level from below. Emmett supplied screws without entering the argument. Doris brought coffee in a thermos, and Reverend Boyd stood at the fallen rail fence long enough to tip his hat. Peace on this house. The sign settled under the eave as if the cabin had been expecting its own name to return altered by time. That winter, after the first finished pieces had left the workroom wrapped in brown paper and labeled with more care than price, Luna began writing her own letter. She did not know who would read it. That was the point. She sat at the table with Miriam's pages unfolded beside her. Ruthie's note waited under the half-dime folder, and a fresh sheet laid square to the edge. The stove burned low. Rain pressed softly against the windows. The owl watched from the cedar case with one clear eye and one clouded eye, both faithful in their own way. She did not copy Miriam's life. A letter to the future that repeats the past too neatly becomes a performance. She wrote what was true of her own hands. "My dear one, whoever you are." Then she stopped for a long while. The words were not hers first, and that was their strength. They had crossed from a dying woman to a displaced girl, from cedar darkness to a repaired table, from secrecy to stewardship. Now they asked to go forward again. She dipped the pen and continued. "I was not ready when I came here. The house did not require readiness. It required attention." She wrote about the roof and the chimney, the way lime taught patience, the reason not to overfill a bird body, the mercy of labeling even common leaves. She wrote that money hidden for the future can become dangerous if loneliness mistakes it for permission to vanish. She wrote Doris's name, and Emmett's, and Orrin's, and Caleb's, and Reverend Boyd's, because inheritance was never only blood or paper or objects wrapped in cloth. It was also the record of who brought soup, who lent tools, who corrected a nail, who prayed without asking to be admired for it. She wrote until her hand cramped. Then she set the pages aside to dry. Near midnight, she carried one lamp to the porch and stood beneath Caleb's sign. Snow had begun again, light and deliberate, finding the repaired roof, the window putty, the stacked wood, the walnut roots, the hidden brass plate, the path to the well, and the creek moving black under white banks. The clearing was no longer abandoned, but it had not become busy. That distinction mattered. The cabin had been waiting, and so had she. In the morning, she would add instructions about blotter changes and safe chimney fires. She would draw the craft mark clearly. She would leave the brass key story without giving away every future question. She would remind the next hand not to lift the granite slab until they understood why it had been left alone. For now, she listened. The Naturalist cabin waits. It has always waited. In town, inside the West End clerk's office, Mrs. Bellingham still kept one of the original bills in her desk drawer beneath the otter paperweight. She had exchanged it from her own purse before the deposit went through, though she never told Luna. The bill was soft at the fold and ordinary to anyone else, but to the clerk it marked the day a condemned structure became an address again. Sometimes, when rain blurred the office glass and another form came across the counter carrying trouble in plain print, she would open the drawer and look at that single dollar. Then she would close it, straighten the next paper, and do her work carefully.